Sarah slowly opened her eyes, or rather tried to open them. Her throat was dry. She felt unbearably thirsty. She wanted to move, but her body refused to obey. Her arms and legs felt like lead and remained stiff. God, where am I and why am I in this state? Rushed through her mind. Panic, cold and clammy, began to spread through her body. Her muscles immediately protested, sending signals to her brain of excruciating pain in all her limbs. Sarah clenched her teeth and tried to suppress a groan. The room was bright, with white painted walls and the same ceiling. There was a pungent smell of disinfection in the air, mixed with the faint odor of medicine. In the corner, a monitor flickered faintly, with the beating of an electrocardiogram line. Each flash of green light counted down on another moment of existence for the patient, in tune with the beating of her heart. The room was silent, broken only by the quiet hum of the equipment and the noise of the ventilation system. Through the fog, Sarah could make out the shapes of figures standing by her bed. One of them was a man of 45 or so, with a round paunch that not even a suit could hide. There was the scent of perfume, French, seemingly from a limited collection, on the edges of his shirt collar. An expensive watch on her wrist, a watch she'd seen somewhere before. Of course, she'd personally bought it for her husband for their wedding anniversary. Extremely expensive, top-grade gold. That's John, the husband. The stranger stood next to her husband like a shadow. Who's that? A medical professional? Doesn't look like it. She looks younger than John. How old is she? 30 to 35. She looks good, much better than me. No wrinkles, not like me, Sarah thought, still unsure of what to do next. Her heart clenched with inner pain. Had she really missed something important? Fortunately, the visitors hadn't seen her awakening and were talking about something of their own, not noticing her trembling eyelids. She was always so smart, so determined, but alas, age has done its work, John remarked half-heartedly. Sarah clenched her teeth and struggled to hold back her sobs. Age. She was only 48. John is 2 years younger, but he speaks of her as if she were an old woman. His companion, meanwhile, pressed her body against his and said softly, "It's a shame, of course. But the key word in your phrase was, you know, I've always believed that you deserve the best and you deserve to be happy, honey." Sarah could feel the blood rushing to her face and her cheeks flaming with anger and pain. She could also hear John cooing sweetly as he talked to this girl and planned his new life, not noticing that she was hearing and understanding everything. "You're right, Emily," he replied and stroked her back lightly. "I deserved this a long time ago. I've suffered for so many years, endured so much. But that's it now, a new life with a clean slate. I'm taking matters into my own hands and moving forward. Well, you don't have to worry so much. I'm always ready to support you," Emily said. At that moment, her husband smiled enigmatically and pulled a velvet box out of his jacket pocket. Sarah watched John eagerly open it, showing Emily a dazzling, shiny necklace. "This is for you, sweetheart, for always being there for me," he said, hugging his mistress. And her I never loved. It was just a habit. Sarah shuddered. She suddenly wanted to scream, to throw herself at them, to tell him how she'd loved him and how she'd dedicated her life to him, how for 20 years she'd fought for their family, for the love he now so easily denied and gave away. "Oh, thank you. What a beauty." Emily gasped and stroked the necklace admiringly. "It will remind me of your love. I want you to know that. You're the only one I love," John said, and unable to contain himself, started hugging her like an awkward schoolboy on a first date. Sarah closed her eyes, barely holding back tears. It was a good thing her husband and mistress had moved closer to the center of the room and couldn't see her face right now. She couldn't believe it had ended so easily. Family life had been shattered in just a few minutes. "We should go," John said, wearily pulling away from Emily. "I'm feeling a little awkward. You know yourself, that Concilium insisted on disconnecting Sarah from the machines. They gave her another 24 hours, and then that was it. I think she'll be grateful to me for that herself." "But why would you do that?" "That's right, I think so too. And how did your son feel about it?" Emily asked and bit her lip coquettishly. "Michael is on the other side of the country right now. He's finishing up university, And he's not my son, he's adopted. But I consider him mine, and so does Sarah. We got him from the orphanage when Sarah had a bad birth. Anyway, Michael has my full support, especially after he found out what he's entitled to in the will. I told Sarah before the surgery it's not going to work. It's the kind of disease that can't be cured. She started it, and she just wouldn't let it go. And now she's lying there like a mummy. Emily nodded in agreement. She hadn't been interested in her lover's family before. Not even now. The main thing was that there was always money on her bank card, and John at least sometimes came to visit. Soon the lovers left, and the door closed quietly behind them. Sarah exhaled a sigh of relief. For a moment she thought they could hear the frantic beating of her heart. When the room emptied, Sarah was finally able to open her eyes and look around. It's okay. We'll get through this. Son's good too. He didn't know what was going on and approved to take his mother off life support. What did I ever do to you, Michael? How many cars have you wrecked in the last year? 3, 4, maybe 5. That makes sense. Unlimited card in your pocket. What's not to enjoy? It's a godsend. Otherwise, felony assault and battery on the bartender, broken storefronts. He transferred to another city for school, so I wouldn't know. Although maybe it was my own fault, torturing my son with my moralizing. Sarah hesitated in her thoughts. At that moment, she realized that her life had changed forever. She realized that she was no longer the woman she used to be. She was crushed, insulted, betrayed. But along with that, a new strength was born in her soul. A determination to survive, to endure, and to punish those who had betrayed her. So the door to the room opened and a man in his mid-20s walked in. He was dressed in an orderly's green uniform and his name tag read Brian. Seeing the patient awake, he cried out in surprise. You've come to your senses? I thought you were all done, Sarah smiled and even tried to joke. The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Brian smiled, then suddenly darkened dramatically. You see, your husband spoke at the doctor's conference and said that since you had been unconscious from the surgery for several days now, the right thing to do was to disable you. But not everyone agreed with that. Imagine it was almost a 5-0 split. And it all came down to one vote, the new doctor, a foreign exchange doctor who said we should wait. And in general, you were lucky, and the operation was performed personally by the head of the department. He pulled you out of the dead. My husband wanted to pull the plug on me, Sarah muttered weakly. Well, why? John said that since you were in a coma, there was no point in keeping you alive and wasting money. The orderly replied embarrassed, as if he was ashamed of her husband's actions. And Sarah felt a wave of nausea, brought on by the realization of the unpleasant truth, come up to her throat. John wanted to get rid of her so he could be with his mistress. I feel better already, Sarah whispered. I hear and understand everything. Brian looked away, as if he couldn't bear the truth that was revealed to him. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and dialed someone's number. Brian said into the receiver, Patient Johnson has awakened from her coma. Appreciates what's going on. No, a resuscitation team is not required. Yes, I'm sure. Having said that, Brian hung up the phone and walked over to her bedside. The doctor will be here shortly, and he will explain everything to you. Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were swirling around in her head. Emotions, anger, resentment, disbelief. Her husband, the man she had spent the last 20 years with, wanted to get rid of her like a tiresome toy. Soon Dr. Smith entered the room. Sarah Alexeyevna, Dr. Smith said, addressing her, I'm glad you're awake. Your condition is stable, but you will need some time to recover. I'll be perfectly frank with you. You have pleasantly surprised me. To be honest, not many people expected a favorable outcome. Fortunately, I wasn't one of them. Brian wouldn't lie. Sarah smiled slightly and said quietly, I am very grateful to you, but I do have one request. I realize it may seem strange to you, but could you keep my fortune a secret for now, so that my husband doesn't know anything? The superintendent frowned and exchanged a glance with Brian, who stretched out. I think I can honor your request. Admittedly, I can't promise for a long time, but I guarantee a couple days. There'll be plenty of rest. And I'll introduce you to Brian. He's the best nurse on the ward. In fact, he's the best nurse in the whole hospital. He was a master swimmer, but he chose to be a nurse. Brian lowered his eyes in embarrassment at the words of the superintendent, and Sarah looked at the kind boy with a smile. Handsome, what can I say? Ah, youth. Sarah had been like that once. But the years go by like 48, soon to be 49. Of course, she's no longer a girl. But what age is that? You've got a lot to live for. There's a reason they say life begins after 40. Dr. Smith left the room. Brian stood for a moment and then quietly left. Sarah watched with a smile as he tiptoed with surprising agility for his height. John had been like that once, tall and trim. Now he had a balloon belly. But there's more solidity in his eyes, more confidence. Such a man should be a factory director at least. And he's still working as Sarah's assistant. And all because he can't be trusted with anything serious. That's the case when there's a lot of ambition, but not much use. If you send him to a business negotiation, he's bound to screw it up. He'll get drunk and start fighting. Ruins his wife's efforts. But Sarah didn't hold it against him. Each to his own, as they say, who learns what he learns. Some people are good at business, some people aren't. So Michael seems to be trying, like he wants to succeed, only gets to the nightclub, and as if he went crazy, looting money, spinning all over the place. And who should be embarrassed? Parents are far away will not scold, and all problems are solved by money. The main thing is that Mom did not forget to repay his loan. Of course, Sarah understood everything and more than once restrained herself. Mole, do not need to spoil her son. Let himself start to earn, as she did in childhood. And in his youth, too, not a minute apiece. In the 90s, the showdown with gangsters, all these roof shooters, do not even want to remember. Where's Michael? His life now is a paradise on earth, as someone famous said. Hard times breed strong men. That's what they say, all right. Lying on the hospital bed, Sarah blissfully closed her eyes and sank into memories. It's funny to say, at least here she will rest for the first time in a long time. And then everything was on her. Business, family, home. Memories of her childhood, youth, and love came back to her so vividly and clearly, as if they had happened yesterday. Sarah saw herself again as a little girl running along a sun-drenched forest path. The air was filled with the smell of pine needles and wet earth, and her father was walking beside her, tall, stately, with kind eyes and prickly, like a geologist, stubble on his chin. Alex Smith was a beloved father, a forestry worker, and a man whose name still sent shivers down her spine. "What kind of bird is that?" little Sarah asked, pointing to a brightly colored bird perched on a branch. "That's a tit, daughter," replied Alex Smith, smiling. "She's a very useful bird. Helps protect the forest from harmful insects." Sarah loved these walks. Her father always told her amazing stories about forest dwellers, about trees, about the importance of taking care of nature. His voice sounded soothing, and his hands, strong and warm, gave her a feeling of security. Their house stood on the outskirts of a small village surrounded by dense forest. It was small, wooden, with carved platmans and a lush flower bed by the porch. It was filled with love and homeliness. Mom worked as a cook in the factory canteen, where she took the train every day. Sarah often helped her in the kitchen, watching how cleverly her mother handled the food, creating real culinary masterpieces from simple ingredients. To the aroma of fresh baked goods, mushroom soup, fried potatoes, it was the smell of childhood, to the smell of home that still warmed her soul. Sarah helped please, her mother would say, placing a bowl of flour in front of her. "We need to knead the dough for the potato pies." And Sarah was happy to help. Each time she became more and more dexterous and skillful in cooking. Unfortunately, childhood was marred by one misfortune. When Sarah was 7, there was a fire in the forest. Staggering in scale, the merciless fire devoured the trees as fast as if they were dry reeds rather than century-old pines and oaks. Dad, as a forester, should rush to the rescue, saving people and animals in the protected area. But the fire was stronger, and soon there was a real threat of burning the village. Realizing that the minutes were counting, Alex jumped into a collective farm tractor and began to hastily plow the land around the settlement to block the fire's path. This method was quite effective, especially considering the fact that the fire equipment from the area was transferred to another place. Death caught up with the young Forrester at the wheel of the tractor as he made the last furrow. "Daddy, Daddy," Sarah, then still small and fragile, clutched at her mother's skirt. Tears rolled down her face in hail, bringing no relief. Amanda herself could barely contain herself, holding Sarah tightly against her, trying to numb her pain. The departure of the head of the family had left a deep wound in the souls of mother and daughter, a wound that would never heal. After father's tragic departure, life changed. There was more silence, more loneliness. Mom worked without weekends, trying to provide a decent life for them. But Sarah felt how much she missed her father, his warm hands and kind words. School became for her a place where she could find new friends and plunge into the world of knowledge. But in this new life, there was one problem that bothered Sarah a lot and made her feel awkward and insecure. After the death of her daddy, she began to stutter. "What's the next lesson?" she would ask, trying to say a sentence. But the words would get jumbled, causing her classmates to mock and whisper. She felt so ashamed, hurt, and resentful. She tried to avoid socializing, sitting alone at recess, feeling alien and alone. "Sarah, don't worry," her class teacher Mary Jones told her. "You're a smart, talented girl. This is just a minor difficulty that you're sure to get over." Mary Jones recommended seeing a speech therapist, and Sarah, supported by her mother, found the strength to make up her mind to do so. In the office of Susan Brown, a generally pleasant woman with a soft voice, Sarah felt much calmer. The speech therapist patiently taught her how to breathe properly, pronounce sounds, do exercises, and read aloud. "Take your time, Sarah," Susan Brown said. "Smile. Everything will work out. The main thing is to believe in yourself." And Sarah tried to believe, practiced hard, gradually overcoming her fear of stuttering. That's where Sarah met Eric, a stutterer just like her. He was Sarah's age, skinny, with dark hair and freckles that covered his nose and cheeks. To Ben pronounced, "He has trouble pronouncing his name." "And I'm Sarah," the girl replied, finally feeling that she wasn't alone. And there was someone else who understood her and felt the same way she did. Ben and Sarah became friends. They practiced with a speech therapist together. Together they overcame the difficulties, and together they rejoiced in their small victories. "Sarah, do you like to read?" Ben asked as they left Susan Brown's office. "Yes, very much. I like books of adventure, of love and long-distance travel." "And I like poems," said Ben. "I want to learn to write them myself." "So well, you can do it, I'm sure," Sarah smiled. A feeling arose between them that they could not yet understand or describe. It was something light, warm, mysterious, the kind called first love. "Sarah, you're so beautiful," Ben said one day, blushing embarrassingly. "Thank you. It's a pleasure." "And you're kind," Sarah replied, and her heart beat faster. It soon the friendship of the two schoolboys grew into tender feelings. They met secretly in the park, walked holding hands, read poems to each other, and dreamed of the future. Sarah, who had recently suffered from loneliness, now felt like the happiest girl in the world. Thanks to him, she believed in herself, her beauty, and her ability to love and be loved. Unfortunately, the happiness was short-lived. One summer evening, as they sat on a bench in the park, Ben told her that her parents were moving to another city. "Sarah, I don't know what's going to happen next," Ben began. And his voice trembled. "We may never see each other again." "Don't say that," Sarah whispered. Tears covered her eyes. "We'll write letters to each other, and we'll never forget each other." "Yes," Ben nodded, "we'll write letters. And we'll also send each other packages, books, birthday presents." The parting was hard. Sarah never left the feeling of longing and emptiness after the separation. She constantly wrote letters, telling him about everything that was happening in her life, her studies, her friends, and the new man in her mother's life. But the answers came less and less often, and there was less warmth in them, less of the former love. Time passed. Sarah grew up. She finished school and went to university. She tried to forget Ben, but the image of the guy never left her mind, and his name sometimes involuntarily came to mind, reminding her of her first love and heartache. It was like that until that memorable spring of '95. The sun, breaking through the young greenery, flooded the campus with warmth. Sarah, slender with a mop of brown hair, was hurrying to a lecture on compromism. Her bright blue dress emphasized her fair skin and dark, expressive eyes. She had never been a beauty in the conventional sense of the word, but there was some special magic in her, attractive, mysterious. It was on that spring day that she met him, John Johnson. He appeared like a character from a favorite novel, tall, broad-shouldered, in fashionable jeans and a leather jacket. His voice was mesmerizing. There was an incredible depth to it and a kind of inexpressible sadness and sorrow. "Excuse me, could you tell me where Auditorium 317 is?" he asked, slightly embarrassed. "Yes, of course. Go straight ahead, then left. It's at the end of the hall." Sarah smiled involuntarily. Her voice sounded a little unsure, but at the same time simple and open, and not the slightest hint of a stutter. "Thank you, Susan Brown." John smiled back. That smile, bright, joyful, like a ray of sunshine on a cloudy day, lit up her heart. "Thank you," he said, and hurried off in the direction indicated. Sarah, remaining where she was, felt happy for the first time in a long time. She herself couldn't understand exactly what it was that attracted her to this strangeness. But for some reason his image never left her mind, and it was from that very day that their acquaintance and subsequent life together was counted ends. And of course, there was still a lot ahead. Tourist trips out of habit rather than necessity to collect potatoes, although by that time, there were no collective farms. But every date was like a holiday, full of tenderness, sincerity, and deep feelings. John came from a fairly well-to-do family. His father ran a vegetable base in the suburbs. But despite this, Alex Smith, and until the end of his short life, remained a simple, modest man who never boasted of his position. John, too, did not boast of his status as a father, especially since in the 90s was gaining popularity quite another occupation: commerce, entrepreneurship. Sarah, in turn, opened her soul to him. She told him about her fantasies and hopes. She dreamed of a large, friendly family, a comfortable life where love and mutual understanding will prevail. John always listened attentively, and his heart responded to the words of his bride. Then he still felt that he had met his destiny, the woman he loved more than life. But unfortunately, they were destined to undergo harsh trials. John's mother, Lisa, from the very beginning was against this marriage, considered Sarah not a good enough party for her son. "John, are you blind? This girl just wants your money," Lisa whispered. When John introduced the girl to her that evening, the son was extremely resentful of his mother's behavior. He loved Sarah and wasn't going to listen to anyone's comments. "Mom, don't say that, please. Sarah, she's a nice girl and we love each other." After first meeting Sarah, Lisa took offense at her son and decided to take matters into her own hands. She started gossiping about the girl, talking bad about her and trying to influence other family members. Sarah realized that the mother of the groom does not accept her, and therefore tried not to pay attention to unkind attacks. But she was hurt by it. "I can't go on like this. It's hard to bear your mom's contempt. She's always interfering in our relationship," Sarah said with tears in her eyes. John hugged her and promised to resolve the situation. After all, he loved Sarah and would never let her suffer. "Don't worry, I'll be sure to talk to Mom. She'll understand that I'm more serious than ever." But the conversation was fruitless. Lisa remained in her opinion, continued to build intrigues against her son's chosen one. But despite all the obstacles on her part, Sarah and John married. The wedding was modest, but very warm and touching. Only close friends and relatives were present at this celebration, and after the newlyweds rented a small apartment in one of the sleeping areas of the city. Their life in those years was full of love and hope. And this despite the fact that in mid-90s the country was going through difficult times. Sarah, an engineering technologist by education, could not find a job in her specialty. Plants and factories were downsizing, workers were laid off in teams. "Sarah, but I can't support you forever. You've got to get a job somewhere," John once said in desperation. Her husband's words were unnecessary. After all, she herself had long realized that she had to find a way to earn money, and decided to go to the hairdresser. She took a 3-month course from the employment center and changed her profile. "Hello, I'd like to apply for a job with you." "Okay, girl, fill out the questionnaire. If you like everything, we'll put you on the staff." The salon was small, with outdated furniture and not very clean mirrors. But Sarah was glad for any space. Times were like that. Just hang in there. She quickly learned how to cut and style hair, and she loved interacting with people. making them more beautiful. Sarah, you are a very talented craftsman. You can do such amazing hairstyles. I think you might even open your own beauty salon eventually, Lucy once said. Sarah's coworker had taken it as a joke at first, but Lucy was quite serious. Sarah, I think we should buy out that hair salon. I'll help you out. I have some savings, and we can open our own salon together. Sarah looked at her in surprise. Was this really serious? She thought about it for a long time, and then, agreeing, she started saving money. She worked without weekends, took additional clients at home, and dreamed of the day when she could open her own business. Only a year later, it was possible to buy out the hairdressing salon. First of all, repairs were made. New furniture and equipment were bought. Thanks to this, salon became one of the most popular in the city. And then more, a cafe by the waterfront, a couple of car services in the center, and the first computer salon in the city. Sarah was happy. And what else do you need? A favorite job, a caring husband, and a life full of bright prospects. And soon she was pregnant. Sarah was over the moon. John rejoiced with her. They imagined how they would bring up their child, how they would read him bedtime stories, walk with him. But fate again arranged a test of strength. Sarah lost her baby in her 8th month. The early labor was difficult, and the baby was born dead. She lay in the hospital, unable to understand why she had suffered such misfortune. Sarah, so sorry you had to go through all this. I will always be there for you, no matter what happens, John assured her, holding her hand. But doubts crept into Sarah's soul. After all, the day before he was late for the discharge, and he had explained it simply. He had gotten drunk with his friends on a fishing trip. Where have you been? Sarah asked indignantly. Sorry, honey, I didn't mean to offend you. Just had a little too much to drink with friends. Well, you don't even know I wanted to see you. I don't want you. Leave me alone with your mommy. As it happened, it was the indifference in John's behavior that drove Sarah into depression. A long, lingering depression. But Lisa, of course, didn't miss her chance to say mean things. I warned you. You can't bear a child. You're infertile. And it's all your fault, you empty vessel. You are an empty vessel. It would be better not to appear in our lives. Sarah couldn't take it anymore and fainted. She had nightmares where she saw her dead baby and felt guilty. At that moment, Sarah couldn't take it anymore, deciding to end her life by paying her bills. She silently dressed and walked to the bridge. The waters of the turbulent river always beckoned her with their leisurely waves, whispering strange phrases in a language they alone understood. Out of the water came the water and the wind, Sarah whispered and gripped the cold railing of the bridge. What the hell are you doing? Came someone's hoarse male voice. Sarah opened her eyes and stunned. The elderly janitor from the kindergarten, Mitrich, was standing in front of her and holding her hand. Let me go. I don't want to live anymore. So you don't have to do that. You have your whole life ahead of you. I too, when my son came in the zinc coffin, I changed my mind a lot, kept not believing he was it. And then I accepted it. I worked as a foreman in a vocational school and became a janitor, closer to the children from the kindergarten, so that my soul would be calmer. And my Tolik is watching from heaven, I know. He looks and smiles. And sometimes he comes in dreams. And she complained recently. He said he was cold there. So I went straight to the church, ordered a service, a memorial dinner. Ooh, sweetheart, you say there's nothing to live for. Please, daughter, don't do it, don't do it. After saying that, Sarah cried like a baby. She felt completely broken. That day, Mitrich helped her reach home, where she spent several days in bed, unable to get out of bed. Sarah, you shouldn't have done that. You have to get up and move on with your life. You have to realize that you're not alone. I love you and I'll always be there for you, John spoke as he put his arms around her and tried to comfort her. But Sarah couldn't get her feelings back. Every day she thought about the loss of her baby, and her heart was filled with heartache. She realized that it was impossible to live as before. She had to find a new way, a new purpose in life. So, to the surprise of herself, Sarah began to keep a diary secretly from everyone, of course, and first of all from her mother-in-law, who by that time, having kept her husband, began to get sick more and more often. As time passed, the pain of losing her child began to subside a little. Sarah learned to live with that pain, and it became a part of life. Also, Sarah was not alone in her tragedy. After all, there are other people who have also experienced the pain of loss. As she developed her writing skills, Sarah suddenly realized that she had unwittingly found her calling. No, business, money, all this is just a means to an end. But the main thing became creativity, at first timid, uncertain, then strong and heartfelt. Sarah began to write short stories and novels. The first work was about a woman who, like her, had lost a child. In this story, Sarah expressed all of her pain and re-nurtured her heartache. Sarah, this is an amazing story. You are a talented author and can write things that will touch people's hearts, exclaimed fellow author Emma. After gaining confidence, Sarah continued to create. Each of her stories was about a woman, her life, love, and pain. On the expanses of the internet, her work has received great popularity. Critics called Sarah Johnson a talented author, and readers said that her books helped them to live. Her stories were even translated into other languages. True, Sarah was not particularly touched by this, because her craft did not bring money and she needed only an outlet. She found it in books. And one day Sarah saw an ad in the newspaper. The local orphanage needed sponsorship to repair the building and improve the surrounding area. "John, let's take a baby from the orphanage," Sarah, who had never been able to get pregnant again, suggested hopefully. A tense pause hung in the room. Frankly, her husband didn't want a baby and was afraid it would be too difficult. But Sarah didn't give up, even though she wasn't entirely sure she could love another man's child. But she also understood John needed support. She herself needed something to help her survive. "Okay," he agreed, "but let's choose together." They visited several foster homes, where Sarah looked at the kids with pain and compassion. And then, finally, she saw him, Michael. A boy about 5 years old with big dark eyes that looked at the world with incomprehensible fear. "Let's adopt him." "The little guy is so cute," Sarah said. "He obviously needs us." John begrudgingly agreed, even though he was afraid Michael wouldn't fit into their family. "Sarah, I have my doubts. To be honest," the spouse said. "He's so sullen, and he looks strange." "Well, make up your mind. Let's give it a try," Sarah pleaded. "We should help him," she added. John waved his hand and began to prepare to gather the necessary paperwork. Michael quickly became attached to Sarah and called her mom from the first few days. He felt her warmth and her love. John, on the other hand, remained cold and a little distant. In his wife's opinion, he never got over his pain and the loss of his child. Michael grew up spoiled and disobedient, doing whatever he wanted. Sarah tried to bring up her son, but was powerless before his whims. "Mom, I want a toy," he shouted, stomping his foot in the toy section of a downtown department store. "Michael, you don't have to act like that," she exhorted him. "We can't buy every toy you see." "And I want this," cried the little boy, tears streaming down his cheeks. John was helpless in matters of parenting, for he did not know how to deal with children. "Sarah," he sighed sadly, "maybe we should give Michael back to the orphanage." "John, what are you doing?" "Don't even think about it," she said emphatically. "We can't abandon him. And it's not like he's a toy. Please understand, get over your pride and realize that we won't have another son." She persuaded her husband, still at length, saying that the child needed love. "Please, John, let's give the baby a chance for happiness." John gave up and finally dumped all the troubles on her: business, raising her son, and even taking care of his sick mother. In recent years, Lisa began to get sick especially often. Her voice, once cold and shrill, was now dull and lifeless. Sarah, despite all the offenses, for about 2 years took care of her mother-in-law, took care of her, cooked meals, and even read books when she was in severe pain. Deep down, Sarah felt that Lisa needed her very much, though she did not say so out of pride. One evening, as Sarah sat at her mother-in-law's bedside, Lisa suddenly grabbed her sister-in-law's hand and squeezed it so tightly that she cried out, "Sarah, I'm sorry." "What are you apologizing for?" "Everything. Honey, for what I did to you. I'm the one who switched your baby. The baby was alive. I bribed the midwife, and she brought you the dead baby of an alcoholic." Her mother-in-law's words were like a thunderclap. Sarah froze in place, her mind refusing to accept this information. "What are you saying? This can't be happening." "No, Sarah, really, I'm the monster. I made sure you never became a mother. I wanted you to suffer and be out of John's life forever. Now I pray to God to give you many years of married life. Please forgive me, Lisa whispered, bitter tears streaming down her face. And where is he? Where's my child? Sarah couldn't help herself. I don't know. Sweetie, gave him to the orphanage. Yeah, ruined your life. And I wanted you to live with that pain. I'm so sorry. Quietly whispered mother-in-law and closed her eyes and never opened them again. Till after Lisa passed away, Sarah was left alone with this terrible secret. She did not know what to do, but was full of hope to find her child. John, who after the death of his mother drank heavily, in her story did not believe her story, writing all on hallucinations caused by strong painkillers. And Michael, a high school student, believed that before death his grandmother had dementia, and her story should not be taken on faith. Despite the skepticism of her husband and son, Sarah still began to investigate. She searched night and day for information about the midwife who had been bribed by her mother-in-law. She was eager to pursue any leads that might lead her to the trail. It was difficult. Sarah faced a lot of obstacles. People refused to help her, fearing possible criminal liability. But Sarah never gave up. She knew she had to find her son. And eventually, Sarah got on the trail of that ill-fated midwife. Ashley was partially paralyzed by this time and could only move around the relief home in a wheelchair. But still, the midwife remembered everything. Yes, I switched the baby, Ashley said. Lisa paid me a lot of money. Said her son should be the sole heir. And I didn't have enough to buy a summer house. I bought the cottage, and it burned down a year later. Where's my child? Sarah asked. Adopted him, answered the midwife slightly audibly. But I don't know who did it. Sarah was shattered. It had seemed to her then that she would never find the baby. Oh, come on, that's nonsense. Two old women made up some bullshit and you believed it. Let's go bet a car for the institute in the catalog to choose a catalog, expressed his opinion husband. But Sarah was not going to give up, and 6 months before the discovery of her signs of a formidable disease, turned to a lawyer, Adam, who at the same time was a member of a volunteer organization and searched for missing people. Sarah could barely contain her excitement and told him everything she knew. I could try to find the records in the orphanage archives, but it would be difficult. It's been years, the lawyer said. Sarah was ready to wait forever, and her soul was full of hope and fear at the same time. But what if she didn't find her son? And what if he didn't want to see her? And what if Adam called her weeks after the investigation had begun? I found him. Sarah's hands would tremble. Finally, her favorite son, John, would be overjoyed. Where is he? Sarah asked with trepidation. The lawyer paused for a long moment, clearly determined to prepare her for something bad. I'm sorry to be abrupt, Sarah, but your son died in a fire at the orphanage. Some of the archives burned. I'll send you a place in the cemetery, photo search. But I'm sorry about that. What are you sure it's my son? Didn't the midwife say he was adopted? Balancing on the verge of fainting, Sarah exclaimed. Adam blanched. Well, it's not like I'm omniscient, but all the documents speak in favor of it. And Ashley, how can I put this more correctly? Well, she's had a mental breakdown at an advanced age. Last time I was at her place, she was talking to a cat and asking it for advice on making a will. Can you imagine? But when I saw her, she was still quite adequate, Sarah observed timidly. The lawyer sighed sadly. If you insist, I can continue the search. Completely free of charge. It's not that difficult for me. Sarah nodded in agreement and covered her face with her hands as she disconnected her phone. John walked casually into the room and shook his head. Oh, stop killing yourself over nothing. Mom said some nonsense and left. And now you can't find peace for the past year. We'd better go cook something to eat. I'm hungry. I'm exhausted. I've been eating and eating lately. I can't get enough. Sarah remained silent, brushed away her tears, and went into the kitchen. Cooking again. And business, cleaning, laundry, dealing with Michael's problems at the university. Was this the life she dreamed of, sitting on a park bench with her friends? Yes, she's become a servant to her husband and son. John can't even tie his own tie, and he wants to run a business, and he's got all these clever words he can juggle. His son's good too. He got into a fight at a disco and tore the dorm superintendent's sweater, and now he wants a rented apartment, and he wants it with amenities. and at least 3 rooms and a jacuzzi and a plasma on half a wall. What's that scholarship worth to him? It's like before, when Sarah in her student years saved every penny, lived on a shoestring, sat nights over the textbooks. What else could it be? Did she study for nothing? The sound of the door opening brought her out of her sad thoughts. An orderly stood on the threshold. "Excuse me, may I? They said to fix your mattress so it doesn't crease. It sometimes turns itself off after each cycle. I'm sorry I'm here. It's just going to be a little hard on the girls," Brian muttered, embarrassed. Sarah smiled. "It's okay, it's fine. You can carry me in your arms right now." The boy blushed and set about his task. Sarah watched his precise and calibrated movements, thinking to herself. Of course, the calculation on the mistake was only for her speedy demise and inheritance. Otherwise, he would never have allowed himself such liberties as buying a necklace. And then there's the mistress. He must have lost all fear. He's not afraid of anything. Well, we'll see who's got the upper hand. You and Michael will not see my money. You become too literate. You got the mustache. So we should call the notary, make some changes to the will. We'll see how they sing then. I've had enough of this for 20 years. Let them be on their own now, Sarah thought to herself, with a smile. Michael really lately had gotten a lot of nerve. He didn't leave the nightclubs, and apparently he intended to pass the session there. What if we cut off access to the money? And John too. What am I, an ATM machine? Sarah thought and asked Brian to get a smartphone from the nightstand and dial a number from the list via video link. Norman, the bank manager, immediately got up to speed and was overjoyed to learn that Sarah was alive and not about to pass away. After listening to the VIP client, the banker also blocked the accounts of Michael and John without the possibility of withdrawing even $1. All the while, Brian stood patiently on the sidelines waiting for the patient to finish talking. When Sarah finally finished handing out instructions to the banker and notary, he exhaled with obvious relief. "Wait a moment," the attendant gently remarked to Sarah. "There's a doctor coming to see you now. The one who participated in the concilium. He voted against disconnecting you from the machines. He came to us from abroad to exchange experience, so to speak, but he was born and raised in our country. Anyway, you'll see for yourself now." Sarah looked anxiously at Brian. "Maybe another time. I'm not beautiful, but I'm still uncomfortable. I'd like to get back to my senses a little." Brian shrugged and left the room without a word. Sarah took a breath. "Well, no one's coming now. Why can't that foreigner stay home? We have our medicine, they have theirs. Each country is good in its own way. But did you really want to go back to your homeland?" At that moment, the sound of the door opening brought Sarah out of her half-slumber. She turned her head anxiously toward the entrance. The door opened noiselessly, and a tall man of about 45 years old, with kind and slightly sad eyes, entered the room. The doctor was dressed in a snow-white robe that emphasized his athletic figure. Sarah froze, struck to the core. Her heart seemed about to leap out of her chest. Her breath caught. It was Ben. Her first love, the high school prince she knew almost everything about, his easy, slightly mocking smile, the dimples in his cheeks when he laughed, and the warmth of his hands when he helped her up the steep stairs at school. "Ben," Sarah whispered. The guest smiled, and that smile was the same as it had been years ago. "Sarah, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Ben's voice sounded a little hoarse with a faint accent she hadn't noticed before. "I don't understand how it happened," she muttered, not taking her eyes off Ben's face. "I became a doctor, Sarah. Came from Switzerland for a few months to help out at the local hospital." Ben smiled sadly. "Life is full of surprises." She froze, unable to utter a word. Her Ben, who seemed forever lost to her past, stood before her now. Not only that, he had become a doctor, had become successful, and had gone abroad. "Although I thought you," Sarah stammered, not knowing how to phrase her question properly to deal with the pain of being separated for so many years. "Yes, Sarah, life hasn't spared me either. Lost my wife a few years ago. Car accident. Left 2 beautiful twin daughters, Alina and Vika. They're 10 years old now. I'm a late father. Yes, my wife couldn't get pregnant for a long time. Even with the possibilities of medicine here, it is sometimes a problem." Ben spoke calmly, but Sarah could see the longing in his gaze, the same one she'd carried in her heart all these years. Sarah listened in silence. absorbing every word and trying to figure out how her friend's life was going to turn out. "I'm so glad you're alive," Ben said, and his voice grew quieter, as if he was afraid to scare away a fragile butterfly with his breath. She sensed more than friendly joy in Ben's words. From his gaze, his tone, his manner of speaking, she realized that Ben still loved her, and had loved her all these years. At that moment, Sarah remembered their first meeting outside the speech therapist's office. The school disco where he, tall and handsome, had asked her to dance with slight carelessness. A teenager's eyes, full of light and kindness, mesmerized her. She fell in love unconditionally, boundlessly. Sarah spent several days in the hospital. Ben was always there for her, taking care of her like she was his most precious treasure. "Sarah, you need to slowly get back to normal, not to load yourself down, to stop thinking about your husband at last. I've made some inquiries. John is sure you don't have long to live, and he's offered this date to the sea," Ben said, tucking her pillow away. "I wish I could be near you," Sarah whispered, looking at him lovingly. "Then I want to be by your side, always," Ben replied, taking her hand in his. Sarah was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks later. John had learned a lot about himself in that time, including receiving a divorce notice and facing serious financial problems due to a blocked card. Prior to this, her husband had been using cash balances and was unaware that he was actually bankrupt. Michael had been expelled from the university for failing grades and was now facing the army. Sarah didn't worry about that, though. If she and her husband failed to bring up a man out of her son, so maybe the harsh army instructors will do it. Who knows? Even though she was still weak, there was hope in her heart for a future relationship. That after all, Ben had offered to stay with him. "Well, not exactly my place. It's at my late parents' house. My daughter Alina and Vic are looking forward to getting to know each other," Ben said and gently took her hand. Sarah agreed almost immediately. She wanted to be closer to him, to his love. The house turned out to be cozy, drenched in the smell of home. Eliona and Vic were so sweet and kind that Sarah immediately fell in love with them with all her heart. "So great to have you with us now, Aunt Sarah," Alina said as she hugged her. Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes. Deep down, she never thought that her life could change so drastically. There was no such thing as happiness, but misfortune helped. "What beautiful girls you are," she said, hugging the twins. They spent evenings together. Ben talked about his life in Germany, about his work, about his dreams and plans for the future, connected with the opening of a private clinic, but already here at home. Sarah, on the other hand, shared her memories with him, happy and sad. "I am so happy to have you in my life. I've never stopped loving you," Ben confessed. "And I love you very, very much," Sarah replied. She quickly got used to the new life, helped Ben around the house, took care of the children, and became a real mom to them. The family spent a lot of time together. They walked in parks, went to the theater and movies, read books. "Mom, tell us a story," asked Alina and Vic, putting to bed. And Sarah read to her daughters with pleasure. She liked to be near them, to feel their warmth and love. Divorce from John went almost painlessly. The husband tried to achieve the division of property, but in the end received only a dacha in the gardening community and a used car, on which he drove at the time of the divorce process. Emily immediately abandoned him, especially since the necklace, presented by John, on the turn turned out to be ordinary costume jewelry, designed to let dust in the eyes. Sarah did not abandon Michael, opened a bank account in his name, but with one condition. The money was calculated for several years in advance, but received the monthly Michael could only after the wedding, the birth or adoption of a child and a job. At first, the adopted son was very offended by her, but then reconciled and even achieved reinstatement at the university. Sarah could only guess what it cost her son, because he did not want to study at all. Brian called his former patient from time to time to see how she was doing. And once he even came to visit and brought a stray puppy found on the street by the trash cans. Eliona and Vic immediately grabbed the baby and hurried to feed and bathe him. That evening, Ben, the daughters, Sarah and Brian, gathered. Unlike everyone else, the young orderly felt uncomfortable and kept looking in the direction of the lady of the house, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the strength. Sarah tried to talk to the boy a couple of times, but he behaved stiffly and, not wanting to develop the topic, switched his attention to the puppy. which the twins later christened Bonnie. And the next morning Sarah was awakened by a phone call. The troublemaker turned out to be a lawyer, who obviously had some information. Otherwise, why else would he be calling her a couple months after the last unsuccessful conversation? Sarah took the call hopefully and ducked her ear to the speaker. "Good morning, Sarah. I have some very good news for you," came the voice on the receiver. She froze in amazement. "And what is that? Your son has been found alive." "How can you?" said. The lawyer immediately corrected herself. "He's alive," Sarah gasped fearfully. "He's alive and closer than you think." "Look out the window, please, and see him with your own eyes," replied the interlocutor. "No more jokes, Adam," Sarah said. On her feet, she walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains with a jerk. Her heart was pounding like crazy, wanting to jump out of her chest. A smiling Brian was standing in front of the window with a huge bouquet of roses. As it turned out, he'd found out yesterday that Sarah was his birth mother, but he hadn't been able to tell her the truth. And all evening he was more nervous than ever. In the morning, with Adam's support, he made up his mind and tried again. But now he was successful. Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes as her son burst into the living room and threw his arms around her. She felt light and happy. After all, it is not without reason that they say that after 40 life only begins, and at 50 you begin to understand the taste of life. But a few more years passed, and the man noticed that his mother's behavior began to change. At first, she simply forgot the words, began to tell something, and suddenly stopped talking, unable to continue the phrase. Stefan didn't see anything wrong with that. It happens to everyone. But Amelie was more and more often lost in the dialogues, confused and flapping her eyes. Then the old woman began to forget and confuse important facts of her own biography. It got to the point where she was seriously convincing her son that she had studied to be a chef. Stefan knew very well that his mother had graduated from a pedagogical university. Her friend and neighbor Kate was a chef. She had talked many times about her studies and her work. Here in his mother's head, apparently, and mixed up the facts of her own life and the story of her neighbor. All this could not but alarm Stefan. Moreover, his mother's friends periodically called him with disturbing news. The man signed up Amelie for a consultation with a renowned professor. The diagnosis was disappointing. Alzheimer's is a terrible, irreversible disease that gradually progresses and takes away the most important thing from a person, his personality. You can try to slow down the progression of the disease, the doctor explained to the worried Stefan. But it is impossible to stop it altogether. Of course, Stefan didn't believe the provincial professor's words at first. What could he know, sitting in this hole? Medicine is advancing by leaps and bounds. Surely there is a way to save his mother, to snatch her from the clutches of the insidious disease. So the man put aside all his business and rushed to Amelie's rescue. He took her to the most advanced centers of the country, contacted with foreign luminaries of medicine, appealed even to doctors practicing unconventional methods of treatment. All in vain. The disease continued to progress. Doctors were unanimous in their opinion. Amelie had a particularly severe case of the disease. The elderly woman almost did not respond to therapy. The disease developed rapidly. No medications or medical manipulations were able to slow down the process significantly. It was hard to realize her powerlessness. Stefan had money, connections, and opportunities, but none of that mattered in this situation. Amelie gradually withdrew into her own world, but there were moments of enlightenment when her eyes suddenly became as they had been before, aware, loving, attentive. Unfortunately, it happened less and less often. Stefan looked forward to such moments to talk to his mother again. He missed her, the old Amelie. But most of the time his mother was now a complete stranger, healthy, childishly capricious, completely unadapted to life and living. Amelie required care and constant supervision. Stefan wanted to move her to his place closer to Paris, but she fiercely opposed. "You want to kick me out of my house and take my apartment for yourself?" Angrily whispered, she looked at her son. The old woman clearly did not recognize Stefan. She saw in the most dear person an enemy. "You'll never make it. Get out, bastard, before I call the police." But with her friends, who continued to visit and support her, Amelie behaved very differently. The old woman suddenly decided that they were her sisters, and she didn't want to leave them. Stefan had to move in with his mother himself. He watched her day and night, because she could easily leave the gas and water on, knock over a cupboard, drink, or eat something completely inedible. It was hard both mentally and physically. It was exhausting, taking up all his energy and time. Stefan couldn't work properly. No, sometimes he had to go to the capital. One of her friends looked after Amelie. But Stefan couldn't take advantage of her friend's kindness. He understood how difficult it was to look after a sick person for 24 hours a day. Amelie still refused to move closer to her son. He couldn't drag her away by force. Even when she was healthy, she didn't like Paris. How will she accept a huge metropolis now that her psyche is so unstable? Doctors unanimously stated that it would be a huge stress for their patient, which would certainly provoke a setback in her condition. The only other option was a caregiver, but even here it was not so simple. She didn't like the professional caregiver Stefan had brought to her mother. Amelie was not shy in explaining her refusal. Stefan was embarrassed in front of these women, but they all understood the situation. He was desperate. For months he lived in his mother's apartment, looking after her day and night. In Paris, he had an accumulation of cases that required his participation and attention. The man did not even imagine how and when he would sort it all out. The well-being of his company, grown from a small firm, was threatened. There was no way out. Mother cannot be left alone. Caregivers she does not accept, and even afraid, beyond the doorstep they are not allowed. In the clinic to lie down categorically refuses. The way out was found by herself. One day Amelie returned from a walk in a good mood. Stefan had just been working, taking advantage of a few hours of freedom. One of his mother's friends, the faithful Kate, had given him a break. She lived nearby and often went for walks with Amelie. Stefan was immensely grateful to her for that. He opened the door with a smile to the two elderly women, his mother and her friend. Immediately he saw that both of them were almost glowing with joy. "What happened?" Stefan said with a smile. "We found a nurse for Amelie," Kate answered. Amelie, who was standing next to her, nodded. "How did you find her?" The man didn't understand. "On the street." You could say that Kate smiled. "There's just one little thing about it," Kate said, "literally a little thing. But don't dismiss it out of hand, because Amelie agreed to it. Can you imagine she chased everyone away, and now she's agreed to it?" "Tell me," Stefan said. "I'm intrigued." It turned out that the old women had met Trixie in the courtyard. She was walking with her son, a charming little boy of 3. Kate called him a little nuance. Amelie immediately penetrated to the boy, treated him to candy, chatted with him about this and that. Meanwhile, Kate was chatting with the child's mother, as she usually did with such chance encounters. "I told Trixie everything," Kate admitted. "About my problem. A close friend that we've been inseparable all our lives is in this state right now. Doesn't remember much. Often imagines herself as someone else, acts like a child." Trixie, the new acquaintance's name, nodded sadly. It turns out she had first-hand knowledge of Alzheimer's disease. The disease had made her once strong and energetic great-uncle a helpless and unstable man. Trixie shared her story as well, and Kate was at first horrified at what this young mother had to endure. And then there was a saving thought, a solution to a lot of problems at once. "Trixie is very young, younger than you," Kate said. "We've been through more hardships than any grown woman can handle. She's lived in the country all her life. She finished school there and came to the city to study economics. She was glad that she entered the university on her own, without connections and without money. She studied hard. I got a diploma, got a job in a small firm. I rented an apartment, supported myself. And she was very proud of it." Trixie said she'd always wanted to escape poverty. In the village, her family was poor, to put it mildly. She shared a cramped room with her 2 younger sisters and brother. Money was always in short supply. The girl had to work part-time from the age of 11 on the local farm. They did not starve, of course, but Trixie could only dream of beautiful clothes, technology, travel. The furnishings of the house were not pleasing to the eye, either peeling wallpaper, shabby ceilings, old furniture falling apart. Trixie wanted to live differently and thought that hard study would help her to change her fate. That's why she spent all her free time working on her textbooks, By the way, it was not easy, because as the eldest daughter, Trixie had a lot of household duties to clean the rooms, clean the yard, cook dinner, look after the younger ones. There wasn't much in the way of study facilities either. The only desk was always full of children's paints, plasticine, toys. The younger ones were always pushing around, making noise, distracting her with questions. Sometimes Trixie would climb into the attic with her textbooks and sit there, listening to the muffled sounds from below. It wasn't completely silent here either, but the attic was still the best place to study. Unlike her peers, Trixie didn't go to dances in the neighboring village or go out with boys. She listened, of course, to her friends' stories about their romantic adventures. Sometimes it was even interesting, like watching a movie or reading a novel. But for herself, the girl firmly decided first study, career, and then you can think about a personal life. It reminds me of my mother's fate, Stefan nodded. Mom was also from a village and from a large family. She also wanted to get back on her feet. She didn't care about her personal life. Did you notice that too? Kate smiled. Of course, I saw the resemblance right away. And Amelie wasn't just taking care of Trixie's baby. She was listening to her story with interest. I could see she liked the girl. And I liked Trixie too, modest, quiet, sincere. So Trixie graduated from the village school with honors and entered the university. She was given a dormitory and a scholarship. The years of hard study began. Studying was hard, but Trixie loved it. She took complex formulas and theorems as a challenge and always won in the end. During her student years, Trixie didn't pay much attention to guys either. She was a pretty girl, slim, tall, with elegant, huge green eyes, long hair the color of ripe wheat, a wonderful honey-colored skin tone. Trixie is still a beauty. Amelie smiled. It was the first time she had entered into a conversation since returning home. Beautiful, though life had not treated her well. But she'll be all right now. Yes, Trixie is a very attractive young woman, Kate confirmed her friend's words. And of course, when she was a student, she had her admirers. But the girl had made up her mind to finish university and get on her feet first, and then think about love, and went to her goal. Her friends offered Trixie other options to get a foothold in the city and live far from poor, to find a wealthy man and decide him. Only such methods were not for Trixie. She wanted to be sure of her well-being. And how can you be sure of it if your well-fed life depends on another man? Anyway, after graduating from university with honors, Trixie started looking for a job. And she found it almost immediately. She got a job as a labor economist in a local successful firm that installs air conditioners. The salary offered to the young specialist was decent, especially if to compare it with the scholarship, on which Trixie had to survive all these years. After all, there was nothing to count on the help of relatives. Her parents barely made ends meet. On the contrary, her mother and father had managed to instill in their eldest daughter that she owed it to them, that she had to support the family when she made it in the world. After all, they had raised her. Trixie supported them at first. She bought presents for the younger ones, transferred money to her mother's card. But when she needed help herself, the family turned away from her. Trixie, a young and very pretty employee, was immediately noticed by Ben, a senior manager of the purchasing department and the son of the owner of the company. The young man, of course, felt like a prince in the office. In fact, he was a prince. Ben had been surrounded by luxury since he was a child. He was used to the fact that all his wishes were always fulfilled. By the time he was 26, the guy had a beautiful life. He wanted something new, something unexplored. And then Trixie got a job with them, a modest beauty with huge eyes and a sharp mind. Of course, it wasn't her looks that interested the young man. No, he had dated both models and actresses. A pretty face was not going to catch him. Rather, he was attracted by the special charm of the young new employee. Her behavior, atypical of most girls, intrigued Ben. He wanted to solve Trixie's mystery, to understand her, to get to know her better. That's why he went on the offensive. And Trixie? She was just at the age when it was time to think about a soulmate. Most of her acquaintances were already married and raising children, and she wanted family happiness too. All the more Trixie thought that she had already achieved a lot. She had studied, worked, and supported herself. Trixie was tired of making her way through life alone. She dreamed of a close person, drew an image of a man to talk to in the evening, who would embrace her after a hard day's work. That's where Ben came in. He was very skillfully courting a young female employee. You bet the guy was a pro at it. Flowers, nice surprises, exquisite compliments, admiring glances. Ben knew how to surprise any girl and was proud of the fact that he could find an approach to everyone. But he'd never met anyone like Trixie before. It was not an easy task, but it was even more interesting. In the end, of course, Ben managed to make Trixie fall in love with him. They started dating. The girl didn't realize that Ben was the son of the owner of the firm. If she had, she might have been more careful. Then she realized it, of course, colleagues at work, noticing that Trixie began a relationship with Ben, told her who his father was. But it was too late. Trixie had fallen head over heels in love. The girl could not imagine her life without Ben. He actually lived in her apartment, and Trixie was completely satisfied with it. The young people had been together for about 2 years. Probably Ben really had strong feelings for Trixie. Before, his affairs had lasted 6 months at the most. But here Ben wanted to take care of someone for the first time in his life. That's what Trixie had taught him, by the way. She cooked him delicious meals, took interest in his affairs and well-being, and didn't demand anything in return. On the contrary, when Ben gave her something, the girl was very touchingly embarrassed. Of course, the father eventually learned about his son's affair. At first, the man did not attach much importance to it. Ben was young, in love, well-to-do. The flighty young man was living his lifestyle. The wise father allowed his son to enjoy his youth, because he realized that if he didn't get used up in his youth, he would strive to go out all his life, all in due time. But the news that Ben had a serious relationship made him tense. It wasn't the right choice. A poor country girl with no family. She's probably hitting on the son of wealthy parents on purpose. She wants to take any chance she can to escape poverty. There are plenty of people like Trixie. But Ben is not a means to her ends. Ben, a young fool in love, doesn't realize he's being used. He says something about her purity and sincerity. He assures her there are no other girls like her in the world. No wonder, because Ben's social circle before he met Trixie was made up of spoiled girls from fairly well-to-do families, fixated on beauty, luxury, and entertainment. Probably this Trixie was wise beyond her years and realized how to behave to make a young man lose his head. Well, good for her, she did it well. Except she didn't take one thing into account. Ben has a father who won't let his son make a fatal mistake. The man decided to send Ben on an internship abroad. Out of sight, out of mind. The father knew his son well. Ben would have a new love there, then a second, then a third. Nothing at Trixie will work out, and it is necessary to act quickly, because such a clever girl to consolidate the effect may well get pregnant. And then she will have a powerful lever to siphon money from a rich family with the help of a child. It's a plan as old as time, but it's still as effective as ever. Anyway, Ben flew away across the ocean. Kate continued the story. Amelie listened attentively to her friend and shook her head. In her eyes, she clearly read pity for the main character of the story, Trixie. Just like in the Carlson cartoon. He flew away, but he promised to come back. He didn't, Amelie said. Just as the wise parent expected, Ben met the next girl of his dreams across the ocean and decided to stay by her side. His father even helped his son start a small business in another country so that he could support himself and his new lover. The man always backed up the only child, did everything to make his life bright, trouble-free, happy. But Trixie had no one to help her. The girl, unlike Ben, very soon found herself in a desperate situation. Soon after the departure of her beloved, Trixie suddenly realized that she was expecting a child. They did not plan to have children yet, so the news did not become for Trixie joyful. On the contrary, the girl felt fear Ben wasn't around and wouldn't be for a long time. The internship was planned to be long, so necessary for Ben's career. Trixie understood, but still felt pain and longing in her soul, not seeing her own face for so long, and then Ben had deleted himself from everyone's social media. Explained that it was work-related. The connection with him was almost cut off. Trixie felt abandoned and alone. She really missed her lover. The girl even began to save her paycheck, money for a trip to the city where Ben now lived and worked. And suddenly such news. Pregnancy, and the term was not small. Trixie hadn't noticed the obvious signs in time, too caught up in her longing for Ben. She blamed the malaise on stress, the delay, hormone imbalances. It had happened to her before. She hadn't expected to see 2 bright stripes on the drugstore test she'd bought just in case. The next morning, Trixie went to the doctor. I don't know if the test was wrong. Trixie was sent to the ultrasound, where it turned out that she was already in the second trimester of pregnancy. The future mother was even told the sex of the baby, a boy. It took Trixie a long time to get used to the idea, and she didn't even think about abortion. First of all, it was too late. Secondly, even if the term allowed, she would never get rid of this child. Trixie already loved him, and loved him with all her soul. Too bad there's no way to contact Ben. He has no idea he's about to become a father. Surely Ben will be happy when he finds out they're having a boy. I mean, most guys dream of having sons. Trixie didn't know, and couldn't have known, that at this time her favorite man was already courting his future wife. A beautiful girl from a wealthy family, the union with which the boy's father entirely approved. No, Ben genuinely loved Trixie when they were together. The lad was quite honest about that, but his father was right about his son. The guy was characterized by his windiness and carelessness and couldn't stay alone for long. Trixie didn't know what to do, how to contact Ben. He wasn't on social media now. The guy's phone wasn't answering. He must have had to change his number. Strange that he hadn't warned her. Even weirder that he didn't call her himself. One day, the girl plucked up her courage and went to the central office to see Ben's father. If anyone could tell her the truth about him, it was only him. It was not an easy step to take, but Trixie had no choice. Time was running out and the due date was fast approaching. It was impossible to survive on maternity pay. It was barely enough money for a rented house. And the baby needs a father, needs a family man around from the first days of life. Trixie can't handle a baby alone. So one sunny June morning, Trixie went to the office of the boss and owner of the firm where she worked to meet Ben's father. Upon seeing him, Trixie's stomach was already showing. The man had figured it out, Kate pronounced. He spoke to the girl rudely and ugly. He said right off the bat that she wasn't the first. Allegedly, she was pregnant by his son, and that he'd met dozens like her. He said that his son was in the middle of wedding preparations in another country, and that Ben wasn't coming back. When Trixie said they could do a DNA test, so there was no doubt about it, the man got angry. He thought Trixie was threatening him and said that if that test proved the child's parentage to Ben, he would condemn the grandchild and raise him himself. And Trixie would go back where she came from, back to her country hole. Anyway, Trixie left the office with nothing. She took a long time to digest the news she'd learned from Ben's boss he was getting ready to get married. Wow, how quickly he'd forgotten her. It was painful and hurtful, but Trixie had no time to sign. She had a lot of issues to solve, to find a cheaper apartment, to buy everything she needed for the baby, to put aside money for the first time, because she wouldn't be able to work for a few months. She had to survive in the conditions that fate offered. Ben's family would not even think about recognizing the child. The chief had made it clear, if anything, he would condemn the baby, and he would certainly succeed. He's got money, power, connections on his side. Trixie was no match for such a man. Trixie decided to stay out of the sight of such men. She was afraid of Ben's father now. She dreaded the prospect of being without the son she had grown to love with all her soul. Soon Trixie was hit with a new misfortune. She was fired. She was dismissed as a pregnant woman under the article incompatibility with her position. With such an entry in her labor book, and even with a small child in her arms, no employer will definitely not hire her. Ben's father was probably taking revenge on the one who had caused him so much trouble. Trixie had to rent a tiny room on the outskirts of the city and work unofficially as a cleaner until the birth. She couldn't have gotten another job anyway. Pregnant, and with such a record in her employment book, Trixie had a small financial safety cushion. The money she'd been saving for a trip to see her lover, but it had run out 3 months after little Edward was born. So Trixie went back to scrubbing driveways. She carried the baby in a carrier, carrying him from floor to floor to floor, down corridors, platforms, stairs, and at the same time singing lullabies or telling Edward stories. It was hard, but there was no other way out. The family, of course, didn't help Trixie's predicament. On the contrary, she received more reproaches than from Ben's father. She was called a disgrace to the family. Trixie, in dire need of support, was hurt to tears to hear these words. Her parents made it clear that she had disappointed them. They had hoped that their daughter would become a great person, help the family financially. And everything was going that way at first, and she dared to get into such a situation. Then the baby grew up, And it got easier, Kate continued. Edward is such a bright, serious little boy. He's just a baby. He helps his mother with everything. Trixie could work more now and earn more money. So she and her son moved here from a bad neighborhood. Trixie rented a better apartment and continues to work as a cleaner, and at the same time is studying for a programmer on some free program. She's unlikely to be hired as an economist now, after this entry in her labor record. And there are more opportunities to earn money as a programmer. So Trixie's doing her best for her son. But it's hard for her to clean the entrances and study. You can see how tired she is. We feel sorry for her, Anomaly. We're good judges of character. We knew right away that Trixie was kind and honest. But she'd had some bad luck in life. That's an amazing story. Stefan shook his head. Can we make a movie about Trixie's life? You don't know the most important thing, Kate smiled mysteriously. Your mom Amelie suggested a wonderful thing. She asked Trixie if she would be her nurse. She offered. Stefan wondered. She's good at it. I didn't realize it right away. I couldn't think of a better option. Trixie is honest, kind, and attentive. She'll talk to Amelie and remind her to take her medicine on time. And she's gentle, kind, smiling. And she has a good boy. She and Amelie hit it off right away. Amelie is like a child sometimes. They'll have fun together. Old boy Kate nodded. And Trixie, instead of scrubbing floors, will study in peace and look after your mother. It doesn't take much physical labor, and it doesn't take much time. And you'll offer her a good salary, of course. With what? See how good that makes everyone feel. Kate's eyes brightened up. She thought it was a wonderful idea. Amelie also thought it was a good idea. But Stefan was still hesitant to let a complete stranger from the street into the house. I don't know what she'd told the two old ladies. Maybe Trixie was a liar, but she had decided to give the old ladies a good talking to, and they didn't know what was what. How smart is it to fool old ladies, one of whom has such a serious illness? But I need to meet Trixie. Ask her a few questions, talk things over. She's going to work now, but she'll come by tonight, Kate said. I've got an 8 o'clock appointment with her. So wait, Trixie promised she'd come by. I'm sure you'll like her. The doorbell rang around 8. Stefan opened it. A young woman stood on the doorstep. Slim, pale, with a tired face but a shy smile. By the hand she held a little boy. Here he looked quite happy and confident. He smiled broadly at Stefan, looking him straight in the eyes. The man felt warm inside. This child was quite charming. Hello, the woman said. I'm Trixie. You've probably heard about me, haven't you? I'm here for a job interview. Come in, Stefan said with a reassuring smile, and let the guests into the apartment. All three of them settled in the living room. Amelie, having taken another dose of medication, slept in her room. She would sleep until about 9 o'clock. Then 2 hours awake, her medication, and then back to sleep, Stefan explained. Amelie has a difficult schedule and a very complex character, corrected by her illness. Not any caregiver could cope with her. I can barely manage myself. But Kate was confident Trixie could do it. I know your story, Stefan said, looking at Trixie. Her son was looking around with lively curiosity. Stefan liked having a child in the apartment. Somehow it made him feel lighter. Good, Trixie nodded. So you understand how much I need this job. I'll do my best not to disappoint you. Amelie and I have hit it off, Stefan smiled. It was surprising, because she had rejected so many professional caregivers. All of them had something wrong with her. Did she take to you right away? I think she's a wonderful, kind person, Trixie shrugged. I'm glad you think so. Mom has a very special schedule. She has to be on a strict regimen, taking her pills by the hour, or her condition will worsen. I also read to her twice a day, the first time a newspaper with news, the second time something from the classics she chooses. I see, I've already mapped out Mom's day for you. Can we start tomorrow? You're really taking me? A smile lit up Trixie's pretty face. Just like that. Stefan grinned. 2 old ladies have made me such a spectacular advertisement. Trixie laughed. You see, that's the thing. I don't know if you realize that the baby will be living here with me, of course. With you and my mother. Stefan said calmly. "That's out of the question. Thank you." The young woman's eyes expressed gratitude. I think she almost cried. Perhaps fate had treated her unfairly. If Trixie is so happy about this job, it's not easy to look after someone with such a disease. Trixie knows what she's getting into, and she's still excited about it. Trixie and the baby showed up the next morning. They didn't have much with them, just a couple of backpacks and a small travel bag. "Good morning," Stefan smiled. "You're just in time. Make yourself comfortable, get settled in. Mom will be up in an hour. I've written out her day in detail." He put the sheet on the kitchen table. "Good," Trixie nodded. "Oh, and if you need anything, call me any time of the day or night. I'm leaving for the local office right now. Now I finally have time for a full-time job. I'm staying here in my old apartment for a couple days. Of course. I'll visit you every night. I'll see how you're doing, and if all goes well, I'll go back to New York, but I'll stay in touch with you, of course." "Yes," I see. Trixie smiled. "Everything will be fine, don't even doubt it." And things did get better. Stefan, who was still in his hometown for a couple days, made sure Trixie was doing fine. Amelie looked happy. She was in an elevated mood the whole time. She liked both Trixie and her adorable baby boy. Trixie was happy too. "This job is a gift from heaven and a reward for all my toil and suffering," she told Stefan more than once. "It's a pleasure to look after your mother. We talk a lot. She sometimes recalls stories from her life, and it's interesting to hear about her years as a teacher. Amelie is very intelligent and sensitive, and she and Edward are very good friends. They can play together for hours, they can build constructors or draw something. It's good that everything is so wonderful." Stefan was genuinely happy. The apartment was now cozy, warm, and somehow attractive. Stefan came in the evenings to visit Amelie and ask Trixie how things were going, and then he didn't want to leave at all. But Stefan couldn't stay either. It would probably embarrass Trixie. "Everything's great," Trixie smiled. "Amelie and I are walking, reading, talking, even cooking together. Turns out she remembers a lot of recipes by heart. True, she can't always retrieve them from memory, but the insights happen while she and Edward play or draw. I study quietly. I can't tell you how grateful I am for this offer. It's a lifesaver for Edward and me." "I'm grateful to you," Stefan replied sincerely. "You make my mom's life happy, and you give me my freedom. I have to get back to New York. I have so much to do there." Stefan flew home with a peaceful heart. Immediately, he was overwhelmed by a mountain of problems. The business had gone too long without the owner's close attention. Stefan plunged headlong into work. The rubble was gradually getting smaller. Even breathing became easier. Every evening he called Trixie via video link. She would tell Stefan how his mother's days were going. Sometimes Amelie would come to the screen herself. Sometimes she recognized her son, other times she didn't. It was scary and painful. It must be impossible to get used to. Despite the treatment, the disease progressed. To top it all off, there were heart problems. Strong drugs had side effects on the whole body, but you couldn't do without them. Trixie took Amelie to the hospital, gave her pills by the hour, put her to bed on time, and looked after her. She seemed to genuinely feel sorry for the elderly woman who had suffered such a serious illness. Trixie helped Kate. Sometimes she was joined by other friends who lived farther away. All of them, like Amelie, had also grown to love Trixie and her son. Stefan rejoiced. He loved that his mom had an interesting and busy life. Doctors unanimously said that positive emotions can slow down the development of the disease. One day, a man named Stefan looked forward to those evening conversations with Trixie all day long. She was a remarkably bright and friendly person. As soon as she said a few words to him, he felt light and calm at heart. Trixie energized him with positivity and energy. She was also, without a doubt, a real beauty. Her eyes the color of birch bark, like two blue lakes, shone on her beautiful face. Now Stefan involuntarily compared the women around him. Many of them were good-looking, but they were spoiled by their haughty appearance, their deliberate capriciousness, their coldness, or, on the contrary, their excessive imposition. Trixie, on the other hand, was natural, lively, real, and incredibly kind. Stefan was glad to have such a person in his life. Sometimes the man came to his hometown of Houston to visit his mother. Now he always brought Edward gifts. It was so nice to choose cars, radio-controlled toys, robots, constructors and children's stores. It turned out that there were so many interesting toys now. It was even more joyful to see the boy's eyes light up with delight. Then they worked out together how to control another machine and what actions can be performed by a cool robot. That was interesting too. Edward was really reaching out to Stefan. He must have missed the attention of a boy. Stefan understood Edward perfectly well. He was in the same situation himself, and so he tried to talk to him more during his visits. Trixie always prepared a festive dinner the night before Stefan arrived. The woman even involved Ami's grandmother in the preparation. She read on the internet that such activities are useful for people with her disease. Patients need to do some household chores for as long as possible, otherwise the disease progresses quickly and they become completely helpless. Stefan enjoyed talking to Trixie, not only about her mother, but about the life of this amazing woman herself. And Trixie seemed genuinely interested in Stefan's affairs. Sitting in the living room, they could talk for hours on end about everything, and nothing at the same time. Little Edward would pop up every now and then and insert his own lines, which both adults laughed lightheartedly at. Stefan loved those evenings with all his soul. Each time he wanted to stay in Houston longer, but business required his direct involvement. So the man returned to New York. One day, Stefan's former classmate Tom, who for a long time had been almost the man's only best friend, invited him to a wedding. Tom did not go anywhere, so he stayed to live in his hometown. He opened his own business here, in which he was very successful. Stefan repeatedly called him to New York, drawing him tantalizing prospects. But Tom always replied that he was fine at home. He wasn't attracted to the capital, so Tom got married. They decided to have a large-scale celebration with hired artists, a spectacular show program, dancing until morning. And of course he invited Stefan to the party. He of course agreed, put aside all his business, and came to his hometown. He was excited about the upcoming celebration and the opportunity to visit his mother and Trixie. On the eve of the celebration, Tom called Stefan and shocked him with the news. "You see, friend, you don't have to come to the wedding alone, but with a girl." Why is that? Stefan wondered. Tom had never made such a demand before. Here's the thing. One of DG's relatives won't be able to make it. It's an urgent business trip. It's an influential person. But his spouse is going, and he's only letting her go on condition that all the men are with the ladies. Jealous. Otherwise he won't let his wife go. Now that's a tough patriarchy. Stefan stretched out. It's commonplace here in the province, so far, Tom joked. Not like what you've got up there in New York. Where am I going to find a girl? Stefan stretched out confusedly. I don't have anyone right now. Paul, one of ours, over there. Kira, she's kind of divorced. I don't think anyone would mind going to a party with you. I mean, it's just a formality. Okay, I'll think of something. Stefan agreed. Don't worry, I'll be there as agreed. Pressing the reset button, the man thought for a moment. Why are you upset? Emily asked. Stefan flinched. His mother had been sitting next to him during the conversation, but she looked absent. It seemed to him that she was in her own world again. But Amelie seemed to have heard and understood everything this time. Tom says I should bring a girl to his wedding. I don't have anyone in mind. What do you mean, you don't? The old woman was surprised. Well, Trixie, invite her. It's good for her to get away. Trixie. But of course, as Stefan hadn't guessed right away, thinking about spending the whole day with her at such a lavish celebration, the man rejoiced. It was going to be a wonderful time. Trixie flushed to the roots of her hair when she heard Stefan's proposal. I don't know, she said. I don't feel comfortable. And Amelie and Edward. You can't leave them alone all day. Don't worry about Kate taking care of the family. I'll make arrangements with her, so I'll do it. Of course, Trixie said, smiling. It's probably been ages since I've been anywhere. Let's make up for it. Please, Stefan said. I'll be ready by 10 tomorrow, and I'll pick you up. In the morning, a complete stranger, Trixie, jumped out of the driveway. Stefan had never seen her like this before. She wore a flowing dress of a lovely emerald hue that suited her eyes. It fitted her slender figure beautifully, the wide satin hemline emphasizing her slim waist. The belt emphasized her slim waist, and her wrist was adorned with massive bracelets of dark green stones. All of these things Trixie had rented from her daughter Kate. Trixie's hair, usually gathered in a ponytail or a bundle, fell loosely over her shoulders. It was adorned with light curls. Trixie looked like a mermaid in this image-enchanting, beautiful, ethereal beauty. Trixie made light makeup, tinted her eyelashes, applied light pink lipstick on her lips. It all emphasized the natural beauty of her face. Stefan looked at Trixie admiringly. He didn't want to take his eyes off her. Yes, he had always seen that she was beautiful, but today he was still amazed. At the sight of this marvel you are. You look absolutely marvelous, Stefan said. He couldn't find the words to express his impressions of what he had seen. Thank you, Trixie smiled, and surprisingly she didn't look embarrassed. As usual, she didn't avert her eyes. They pulled up in front of the old registry office. It was the only place in their town where marriages were registered. Parking was hard to find. Tom had warned them that there would be a lot of guests. Stefan took Trixie's hand and led her past the dressed-up people to the right hall. Periodically, the man said hello to someone he knew, but didn't stop to talk to them. He would have time for that. Right now, he didn't want to disturb the idyll. He walked with Trixie through the crowd and held her hand in his. People were looking at them, whispering. Stefan saw it and heard it, and to his feelings was added one more, the pride of having such a gorgeous beauty, a real mermaid, by his side. Trixie was looking around with interest. It was obvious that she liked everything that was going on. Then, finally, Stefan saw Tom. He looked very organic and effective in the role of the groom. Next to him stood the beautiful DG in an obviously expensive ivory dress. Stefan knew her. She was a girl from their court. They had once considered her a boy, since she was 2 or 3 years younger. And now DG becomes Tom's spouse. Congratulations, buddy. Stefan hugged his friend. He had to let go of Trixie's hand to do so. Thank you. And you too. Tom whispered to him. Your lady of the heart. She's beautiful. Why did you lie to me yesterday about not having a boyfriend? You two obviously adore each other. Really? Stefan was surprised. Do you think so? I don't think so, Tom smiled. And then there was a solemn registration of the marriage, a traditional trip with a photographer to the local sites and monuments. People were having fun and socializing. One by one, bottles of champagne were opened. Trixie immediately made friends with the bride. They joked merrily with each other and exchanged friendly remarks. The man relaxed for the first time in a long time. Tense work, problems with suppliers, anxious thoughts about his mother's rapidly deteriorating health, all of this had receded somewhere. He was having fun with his friends, laughing at the jokes of others and joking himself, enjoying the closeness of his beautiful companion. And she, it seemed, also felt in a pair with him organically and naturally. The first part of the wedding was over, and everyone went to the restaurant. There, the guests were waiting for a luxurious show program, a good host, spectacular numbers, dances, contests, delicious snacks. The man and his companion danced a lot. The girl moved quite gracefully and relaxed, certainly leading the dance. It was easy and pleasant to adjust to her movements. He did not like and could not dance, but he could not refuse his beautiful lady. The day flew by. It got dark outside the windows, but the holiday was not going to end yet. It was time for the next key moment of the celebration, the hunt for the bride's bouquet. All the unmarried were lined up in a row in the center of the hall. The girl did not want to go, but the man gently pushed her towards the others. The bride turned around at the girls, frozen in anticipation, and smiled slyly at them. It seemed to the man that she winked at his companion. And then the bride threw the bouquet to her. The bouquet itself flew into her hands. Applause broke out, and the host asked the man to come out to his lady. He approached the embarrassed girl and took her hand. She looked quite confused, so he put his arm around her waist encouragingly. Well, young man, said the host into the microphone. You see, fate has decreed that your wedding is next. Kiss the bride. The guests around began to applaud, and then also chanted bitter, bitter. You see, there's no other way out, he smiled affectionately at the girl. And he did what he had dreamed of all evening, kissed her. She was at first a little embarrassed in his arms, but then she embraced the man, pressed herself against him, and answered the kiss. Stefan wanted that moment to last forever. But sure enough, after a few moments, Trixie pulled away. She was looking at the man in a kind of frightened way. "This is the most beautiful kiss I've ever seen," the host continued to broadcast. "Everything is going to be great with you guys." Stefan led Trixie by the hand to the back of the room where there were fewer people. He wanted to say something to her, to cheer her up, to ease the awkwardness after the kiss, but he couldn't find the words. The man was overwhelmed with emotion. He suddenly put his arms around Trixie again and tried to kiss her, but she gently pulled him away. No, Trixie shook her head. "You're my employer, I'm a subordinate. I've had an office romance before and I know how it ends. I can't lose this job, do you understand?" Stefan nodded. Trixie had a right to distance herself. Only were they really just employers and subordinates. What about their heart-to-heart talks, the companionship that made both of them feel warm? What about that kiss, which Stefan was sure had brought pleasant emotions to her too? What about the hand in his palm? The rest of the evening passed without incident. Trixie was always there for him. She was also smiling at Stefan, taking his hand again. The man admired her, caught her glances and smiles, watched Trixie's graceful movements, and fought the urge to hug and kiss her again. The man realized he was in love. In love for probably the second time in his life. And Trixie seemed to sympathize with him too. But she was afraid. There was too much at stake for her in the event of another mistake. Stefan made no more attempts to hug or kiss Trixie. He was just acting like a good friend again. He didn't want their relationship to lose its ease, its naturalness. Let things go the way they were going. After the party, Stefan took Trixie home in a cab. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," the beautiful woman smiled at him as she got out of the car. "I'd never been to an event like this before. I guess I felt like Cinderella when I got to the ball." "I'm glad you liked it," Stefan nodded. Then the man went back to Chicago. And everything went back to the way it had been. Busy work, evening calls with Trixie, socializing with friends and coworkers. Only now Stefan thought about Trixie all the time. He remembered her green eyes shining with delight, her hair flowing down her back, the warmth of her palm in his hand. And of course he often returned to that kiss in front of the crowd of guests. That kiss had changed many things. It had made Stefan realize that he was really in love with Trixie, and there was no use in resisting that fact, and no reason to lie to himself. Except Trixie was afraid of getting burned again, and was holding on to her job very tightly. She had already had a situation in her life, when an affair with the boss's son had hurt her and ruined all her plans. Of course, the woman didn't want to repeat, especially since Trixie was now responsible not only for herself, but for Edward as well. But did she really think Stefan was capable of such meanness, that he could do to her what her old boss or his son had done to her? During the conversation over the video link, Trixie was on her usual behavior. She was friendly, cheerful, and smiled a lot. True, she'd been giving Stefan a lot of unhappy news lately. Amelia's condition was worsening. And it wasn't even about the main diagnosis Trixie shared. Everything was going more or less smoothly. The old woman was managing to look after herself. Her speech was still intact. Although the doctors had predicted that would have happened a long time ago, her heart was a concern. This morning she had another attack. I called an ambulance. They came, gave her a shot. I asked what to do to help her, how to relieve her condition. Because this is the third attack in a month. But they answered the same as always: what do you want? Age. Nobody lives forever. That's the answer, Stefan said. I'll get her into the cardiology center in New York. He felt sorry for his mom, who was clearly agonizing and suffering. He was also worried about Trixie. Stefan remembered well the indifference of the local doctors and their attitude toward elderly patients. And his heart was also gripped by fear of losing the person he loved the most. No, he understood, of course, that nothing lasts forever under the moon, but he was not ready to part with his mother right now. Stefan managed to get a consultation with a famous professor cardiologist. He won a place for his mother in the best cardiac center in the country and rented a special car for transportation of elderly and seriously ill patients. All this cost him some labor and took time. As it turned out later, there was almost no time. Even later, After the worst of it had happened, Stefan had chastised himself for dealing with all these issues instead of spending his last days with his mother. Trixie soothed him, hugging him, stroking his head like a little boy. "Yeah, you're right, of course. How could you have known it would happen like this? I mean, you hoped for the best and did everything you could to get your mom fixed. It didn't work. Not in time," she said. When everything was almost ready to move Amelie to New York, Stefan received a phone call from Trixie at an odd hour. The man immediately knew he was in trouble. Usually they communicated in the evenings, and then suddenly there was a call in the morning. Something had obviously happened. "Amelie's in intensive care," Trixie said in a broken voice. It was obvious she could barely contain her sobs. She'd gotten sick last night. "I thought it was another attack, called the ambulance, and there was a heart attack. She's in serious condition, owning intensive care. So we can't move her. We can only rely on the professionalism of the local doctors." Stefan wanted to fly home, to sit by his sick mother's bed, to talk to her. But Trixie said that Amelie was in a coma, and there was no need for an emergency visit. Stefan obeyed Trixie. He finished all the important things at work. Immediately after that, he packed up and went to his hometown. The man lived here for about a week, stayed in his apartment. It was hard for him to return to the house, where his mom was not there now. And he didn't want to see Trixie. She shouldn't have seen him so upset, so scared, so helpless. The man had been in touch with the doctors the whole time. He'd procured the necessary medications and even equipment for her mom, constantly inquired about her well-being, brought the best doctors to the hospital. But Amelie's condition, despite all these efforts, remained stably serious. And then suddenly that call at 6 in the morning. Yes, Stefan understood that his mother was between life and death for a week, but to the last he hoped for a favorable outcome. He believed, like a child, in a miracle. The doctor's words that morning came as a surprise and a heavy blow to the man. Through the pain, tears, and despair, another, seemingly inappropriate thought took shape in his head. What about Trixie? After all we had in common was Amelie. Now that Mom is gone, Trixie and little Edward will be out of my life too. The realization made Stefan feel even more painful. On that day, he found the strength to go home. He had to find some paperwork for the burial. Trixie threw herself around his neck, hugged him tightly, and sobbed. "I'm going to miss her so much," she sobbed. Stefan cried too. He felt neither shame nor embarrassment. He was saying aloud what was tormenting him: his own guilt for not saving his mother in time, and his regret for not being with her the last few days before the heart attack. Trixie calmed the man down, made logical arguments, found the right words. 3 days flew by. The funeral, the wake, settling a mass of legalities, and the agony of getting used to the idea that Amelie was gone and would never be again. Trixie was there for him, helping, supporting. For Edward's sake, Kate had taken him in for the time being. "The boy doesn't need to see all this and have his heart ripped out," she said. "It's too much stress for a young child. Let him stay with me for a while." Trixie and Stefan agreed that it would indeed be best. Then the day came when Trixie packed her things and got ready to move out. She called Stefan and said, "Edward and I are leaving for a rented apartment. Thank you for such a great job and a wonderful time." "I'll leave the keys with Kate," Trixie said. "It was a pleasure to meet you." Stefan didn't know what to say to Trixie. He knew, of course, that she was going to leave now, but he hadn't thought it would happen so quickly. He'd hoped that Trixie and Edward would stay in the apartment at least until the end of the month. Suddenly they were leaving in such a hurry. The man wanted to beg her to stay, but he only wished her luck in her new place. He was too shocked by everything that was happening. A couple days later, Stefan returned to New York, and there he couldn't stop thinking about Trixie. He missed their evening conversations, wanted to see her smile, hear her voice, look into those bottomless eyes. One day he'd made up his mind, realized he couldn't go on without her, left everything behind, and rushed off to find Trixie and Edward. Stefan decided to start with Kate. She'd had a lot of contact with Trixie. Surely the neighbor would know where Trixie had gone. Stefan had tried to call her, of course, and more than once, but her phone wasn't answering. She'd changed her number or something. Then it turned out Trixie had dropped her phone in a puddle and had to buy a new one. So she decided to get a better tariff, She got a new SIM card. That's why Stefan couldn't reach her. Kate didn't know where to find Trixie, so Stefan had to hire detectives. They quickly tracked down the woman's location. Trixie was once again working as a cleaning lady. Stefan had gotten that information from his people. They even provided him with the girl's work schedule. That's why Stefan found himself at the right moment that morning near her entrance. The man noticed a familiar silhouette from afar. Trixie was coming back from work, walking slowly, enjoying, probably, the beauty of the fresh July morning. Stefan's heart raced. How would she take him now? What if she pushed him away again? What if he'd imagined that she sympathized with him too? Just wishful thinking. Trixie kept getting closer. Stefan stood up and moved toward her. She stopped, recognized him, and suddenly threw herself at him. She hugged him, clung to him, cried. Stefan smiled. Everything was going to be okay now. Trixie was obviously happy for him. I missed you so much. Trixie finally said. I was so hoping you'd find me. And you did. I couldn't help it. Stefan smiled at her. His heart heaved with joy. He wasn't wrong. Trixie really loves him. Remember when you caught the bouquet at the wedding? He said. You can't break tradition. How could I not find you after that? A millionaire takes in a beggar with a baby as a nurse, and when he jokingly invites her to his wedding. Stefan had just learned that his mother was gone. It was early morning when the call came from an unknown number. The man was already awake, lying in bed, struggling with anxious thoughts. He had a premonition of trouble. Probably, after all, his elderly mother had been in intensive care for almost a week. Her condition all this time remained stably serious. And after that call, the man realized everything before he even answered the call. Stefan was a mature and strong, successful man. Moreover, in recent years, he himself had become a support for his mother. It was as if they had switched places. Now the grown-up son behaved like a parent, and his mother turned into a child. And yet, after the doctor's words, Stefan suddenly felt like a thin, weak blade of grass in the wind. Gone was the support, gone was the hope. The man felt like an orphan, through the pain, despair, and rejection. Strangely enough, thoughts of Trixie came through. What would happen to her and her young son Edward now? Would they too disappear from his life? Because Amelie was the only thing that had held them together. And now she was gone. Stefan hadn't expected himself to be thinking about Trixie at a time like this. But it was now that the man suddenly realized that he didn't want to lose her for anything. Surprisingly, it was a thought he would ponder later. Right now, he had a lot of things to do, organizing a farewell, settling some legalities. It's a good thing. It would take his mind off his grief, prevent him from falling into despair or apathy. Amelie raised her son by herself, without the help of relatives and her husband. She gave birth to Stefan, being already quite an old woman. She was almost 40 at the time. In those days, it was a very respectable age to become a mother, especially for the first time. Amie's peers were already nursing grandchildren when she was getting used to being a mom to a newborn baby. The woman had no regrets. This child became the center of her universe, the meaning of life, joy. And Amie more than once said this to her son, called his happiness, favored boy, pride and hope. With Stefan's father, the woman did not work out, and could not work out. It just happened. Amelie was born and raised in the village. Then, like many of her peers, went to study in the city. Amelie dreamed of working as an elementary school teacher. First, she always got along with small children. Secondly, she clearly had a talent for conveying information to these little ones in an accessible way. Amelie had taught a single child to read by herself when she was still a teenager. She was provided with a hostel, a minimum stipend as a non-resident, and her studies began. The girl liked studying. Soon she became one of the best students of the course. Her parents were proud of their successful daughter. Of all their children, she was the only one who entered the university, and even became an excellent student there. While classmates ran on dates and discos, Amelie gave all of herself to her studies. She was hardly interested in guys. Then, at a young age, the main thing was to get out of poverty, to get a foothold in the city, to establish themselves in the profession. And then you can think about your personal life. Amelie graduated from university, worked for a year on assignment in her own village school, and again went to the city. She rented an apartment there, got a job at a language gymnasium. A young specialist with a red diploma was accepted for a prestigious position with a good salary with great joy. She liked the work. She easily managed to find a common language with all the students. She knew how to explain complex topics to kids. Children reached out to her, respected, and even loved their first teacher. Amelie was glad that she was able to find her way in this life at once. Many people cannot work at a job they do not like. They suffer, looking for something new. But she immediately found herself in her place. True, here with a personal life did not add up. Appearance, she had a pleasant. Her admirers periodically appeared. Whether each of them repulsed her something, sooner or later someone turned out to be greedy, someone boring, and another generally boorish. And so Amelie was left alone. It's time to lower the film. Age is also not young, shook her head mother when her daughter came to the village to visit relatives. Demands you, it seems, too high, driven completely in his city. It's high time you got married. Her sister joined in. She was older than Amelie by only a couple of years, but she was already the mother of 4 children. The sister had recently divorced her husband and was living with her daughters at her mother's house. She did not work with their father, as her girls were still very young. Amelie periodically helped the single mother with money and always felt sorry for her. To hear from her sister words about the need to urgently run to the marriage was especially strange. It's time to give birth, the mother continued. Age is pushing you down. If you don't have time, you'll be alone and needless in your old age. These conversations depressed her, made her feel somehow inferior. Amelie was quite satisfied with her life, her favorite job, a beautiful, albeit rented, apartment, socializing with friends, traveling. Yes, sometimes she dreamed of a beloved and reliable man next to her, and a child, of course. But applicants for the role of husband and father of descendants in Amelie's environment has not yet been observed. Worthy specimens were already sorted out, and other options woman categorically did not suit. She did not want to become an unhappy, almost destitute single mother like her older sister. One day Amelie was sent to the all-Russian competition of elementary school teachers, but not somewhere, and in the capital. The woman then returned with a victory, which earned herself even more respect from the administration. Oh, they even wrote in the local newspaper. A full-page article with several color photos. But Amelie didn't just come home with a win. At the time of her return, she had no idea that a new life was already living and developing under her heart. After the award ceremony, which took place in a huge concert hall, Amelie decided to take a walk around Moscow. Amelie visited many places in one evening: Red Square, the Tretyakov Gallery, and the famous zoo. A little tired, but overflowing with impressions, she returned to the hotel. Almost reaching her destination, Jacob, the future father of her only child, called out to her. She hadn't realized it at the time, of course. He was a handsome, tall man, smiling, charming. He introduced himself as Jacob and said that he lived in a neighboring hotel. Jacob had come to Moscow for work. He, in his own words, often had to do it. He confessed that he had been watching Amelie for a long time, and that he liked her very much, but he still did not dare to approach her. And tomorrow the man was already leaving. That's why he took the risk of meeting her, because there would be no other chance. They talked for a long time, sitting on a bench in the square in front of the hotel. Amelie herself was surprised at how easy it was for her to talk to this man. She felt as if they had known each other for years. Jacob was from Novosibirsk, a large city in the north of the country. He admitted right away that he was married, but unhappy in his marriage. Amelie felt sorry for him for some reason, and in general she behaved that evening quite differently than usual. Her seriousness and innate caution had evaporated. She explained it to herself that she'd had too many experiences that day. Jacob was handsome, and his manners were very pleasant. So they spent the night in Amelie's room. No promises, no commitments. They both knew they'd never see each other again. They just accepted it as it happened. Two adults were drawn to each other by an irresistible force. Amelie had never allowed herself to do anything like that before, but she couldn't resist, and the atmosphere was conducive to play. The woman, as if trying on the mask of someone else, allowed herself to be more liberated, free than always. They said goodbye in the morning. Jacob hugged Amelie tenderly, kissed her, and said many beautiful words that made the woman blossom and feel like a queen. Yes, they would never see each other again. but it was a blessing to have met such a man in her life. Amelie knew she would remember him fondly. A month after returning home, Amelie realized she was expecting a baby. At first frightened, but then overjoyed. Wasn't that what she had once dreamed of? Yes, it didn't work out with her husband, but she would have a son or daughter. When her parents found out that Amelie had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, they were furious. Shame the father uttered when he heard he was about to become a grandfather again. How could it be? What on earth have you done? Wailed the mother. Don't expect any help from us. You made your own mess. You'll have to clean it up yourself, the father joined the conversation again. Didn't you rush me into motherhood? Amelie reminded her parents. She hadn't expected a different reaction, so she wasn't particularly upset. It's a shame and a disgrace to give birth without a husband, her mother repeated and pressed her lips together resentfully. Amelie realized that she could manage on her own without the help of her husband and family. She had a good job that allowed her to rent an apartment and to do almost nothing for herself. Yes, it may be difficult, especially the first years of maternity leave. But nothing will get out of it somehow. The joy of realizing soon motherhood overshadowed all other feelings and emotions. And then Stefan was born, a wonderful, healthy baby, very much like his father, who had not even suspected the existence of this miracle. And Amelie suddenly felt truly happy and whole. The woman had no doubt she would overcome everything, cope with everything. Stefan knew this story from his mother's words. She had told him everything when she was a teenager. Her eyes shone with joy. It was obvious that she was very happy with the memories. Stefan admitted that his mother had embellished the story. Of course, it had been very difficult and frightening for her at times. Maybe there was resentment for the relatives who had returned at a difficult time, and for Jacob too, who hadn't changed at all since the meeting. Either way, his mom had said many times that Stefan's appearance was the best thing that had ever happened to her. And her son believed her. Stefan grew up to be a handsome and bright boy. Unlike many other children, he hardly ever got sick. The boy had excellent grades, and also had time to practice chess and swimming. He was successful in both sections. Stefan went to competitions and tournaments, won medals, participated in school Olympiads. Sometimes Stefan missed his father, whom he did not know at all. But he didn't tell his mother about it. He didn't want to upset her. So it was not easy. In order to provide for her son, she not only took 2 jobs at the gymnasium, but also tutoring. Stefan saw it, appreciated, understood, and dreamed of growing up to become a successful rich man and pile his mother with gifts. Amelie tried to give her son everything, but did not spoil the heir, of course. And there was no such opportunity. Nevertheless, the woman always found the means to send Stefan to the next competition or pay for his section. When the time came, Stefan entered the budget department of the local university on his own. After graduating, he became an IT specialist. After receiving his diploma, the young man first got a job at the town forming plant. He was immediately offered such a salary that the guy was even dizzy with surprise. It cost him a lot of effort to keep himself in control. Over time, the young specialist was noticed, appreciated, made the head of the department. His salary, accordingly, increased significantly. Within a year, the guy was able to buy himself and his mother a large apartment in a prestigious area of the city. Finally, they moved into their own place. The rented apartment was, of course, cozy and already quite native, but it still belonged to a stranger. And here, at last, their own corner. Amelie couldn't get enough of her son. He was handsome and clever, and now he was rich. Stefan didn't work for his employer for long. One day he decided to take a risk, opened his own company. He already had work experience. He understood the peculiarities of the service market. Of course, it was not easy to make up his mind. To leave the forced money place, to rush like in a maelstrom with his head into the business, which is still unknown whether it will bring profit. But deep down, Stefan felt that everything would be fine, because he had a clear plan. And so it was. Stefan's firm grew, developed, brought more and more income. It was the kind of money that could not be earned at the factory, even in the highest position. The guy skillfully managed the funds, something let for the development of business, something put aside, something sent in investments. And of course, Stefan, as he once dreamed, made gifts to his mother. Now he could afford it. Eventually, Stefan had to move. He grew up in a small provincial town and started a business there. But his business grew. He became cramped in the provinces, so a new stage in Stefan's life began, conquering the capital. It wasn't easy. Competition, the need to deal with many issues, both business and purely domestic. The guy, at times, did not sleep for 2 days. But Stefan managed to cope. He got his business up and running and settled in. Now he lived and worked in Moscow. Stefan tried many times to move his mother closer to him. It seemed to him that nothing could keep her in her native city. But he was wrong. At first, Amelie did not want to part with her work. Great. I'll get to graduation, and then I'll think about it. Where will they go without me, she said. Then, already on a well-deserved rest, she was kept in place by other moments, friends and neighbors, familiar yards, apartment. In general, Amelie refused to move. It seemed to her that she would not find her place in the capital. You work all the time, all in business and labor, and I do not know anyone there. What am I supposed to do? Sit all day long in 4 walls. At least I have friends here. We go for walks, to the theater, to cafes. But what's waiting for me there? In the end, Stefan realized that it is useless to persuade his parents. He often came to visit her or brought his mother to stay with him. Amelie, by the way, did not like Moscow very much. She quickly tired of the city. But Stefan enjoyed being in the metropolis. He felt like a fish in water here. So many events, so many opportunities. So many opportunities, so many potential options for profit. As for Stefan's personal life, it was not as successful as his work. When he was young, he had lovers and fleeting hobbies. But even in his younger years, Stefan realized that all these were nothing more than short-term romances. The guy has formed in his head an image of the other half. At the head of the chapter, he put such qualities as intelligence, kindness, sensitivity, loyalty. But none of the girls, which in large numbers hovered around the successful young businessman, did not meet this ideal. And then Stefan met Kira. It happened in a club, where the successful businessman and his colleagues celebrated the conclusion of another contract, which was to bring good profits. A tall, slender girl fell on Stefan's head in the most literal sense. She was accidentally elbowed by a careless waiter. That's why the beauty couldn't stay on her feet. Afterwards, Stefan found out that it had all been a setup, the acquaintance and the clumsiness of the waiter, who turned out to be Kira's former classmate and accomplice. But then the incident had been a small miracle and resembled a scene from a romantic comedy. Kira and Stefan met. The girl immediately charmed the young man with her modesty, even shyness. It was hard to believe that with such a spectacular appearance, Kira remained not spoiled, sensitive beauty that Stefan knew. Usually they behaved like capricious princesses, but this girl was strikingly different from the others. That was probably what had gotten Stefan hooked. They started dating. The closer Stefan got to know Kira, the more he fell in love with her. Here's the updated story with the names changed. The girl was not only beautiful and smart, but also incredibly kind. She pitied stray animals and abandoned children, cried over the sad endings of movies, always served beggars. And Kira, unlike Stefan's previous girlfriends, didn't demand gifts. No, Stefan had never been greedy. When a young man met a girl, he always wooed beautifully. He liked to please people close to him. Therefore, Stefan did not spare money and time for surprises. But the girls very quickly began to abuse the generosity of Stefan, which immediately repelled him. Because the feeling that you are used, it is always unpleasant, and Stefan couldn't take it. Why continue the relationship if they see you only as a resource? The guy had already decided that all young women are like that, or become like that next to a successful man. But then Kira came into his life. Kira looked at Stefan with admiring, loving eyes. She didn't need expensive jewelry, travels, money, but only if he was near her, the man she loved. It filled Stefan with happiness. He felt that he had finally met his other half, and he was beginning to think that it would never happen. But it soon became clear that it was all a setup, the supposedly chance meeting with Kira, Stefan's affection for her, and most importantly, her perfect behavior. It was all part of an elaborate plan. Nick, Stefan's financial deputy, had long wanted to take over the firm, and he planned to frame and imprison the chief so that he would not interfere. Nick had spent years delving into the financial and legal nuances of the company. Stefan trusted him. They'd been classmates once. Back then, Nick had seemed like an honest, straightforward, and very smart guy. Stefan never imagined he'd do that to him. Kira was Nikolai's girlfriend. Together they had devised a plan, according to which Stefan would lose his head over the young beauty, and then they would set up a situation in which Stefan would sign the necessary papers and go to prison, and Nick would take his place. Who else could take over the firm? He's the second in command. Stephen uncovered the plans of the criminal couple quite by accident. Of course, Stephen never worked another day for him after that. And Kira was the hardest part. I didn't want to believe she was faking it. Her meek smile, her loving gaze, her hugs and kisses were all lies. Stefan searched for excuses for his lover, but found none. Everything pointed to her being a despicable traitor, even if it didn't fit the image that had formed in Stefan's head. Of course, they broke up. Kira tried to stay close to Stefan. She apologized, blamed it on Stephen, swore her love and loyalty. It took a huge effort for Stefan not to believe her again. As it turned out, it was a wise decision, because leaving Kira in her heart told the young man a lot of unpleasant and hurtful words. It was painful to see the once favored beautiful face curved with a malicious grin. After this sad story, Stefan stopped trusting girls and he never dreamed of a new serious relationship. In his life, he still had short-term, non-committal romances. Everything was fair and clear there, but Stefan did not make any far-reaching plans. The man was satisfied with his real life, the center of which was, of course, work, a favorite job that would never betray or hurt him. Amelie was sad about that. Do you want a wife? Kids? Amelie listed. Are you planning to live your whole life alone? It's good now, but when you're old, it's uncomfortable. You'll be cold. But you can't change anything. It's up to me. Stefan tried to avoid the conversation. I'm surprised at myself, Amelie sighed. My parents used to push me to marry, to hurry me to have children. I didn't understand them then. I thought, why are they meddling in my life? And now I'm saying the same words to you. It's strange. And so everything went on as usual. Amelie enjoyed her freedom after a well-deserved vacation. She had a wonderful company, a couple of former colleagues and a neighbor. The women were all the same age. They went to theaters and cafes, just walked in the park, even traveled. Stefan was glad that his mother's life was not limited to soap operas and sitting on the bench in front of the entrance. The mother-in-law kicked the village orphan daughter-in-law out the door, and after a while of seeing her, numbers were crucial in Nelly's life. And could it be otherwise with more than 40 years of accounting experience? Immediately after the institute, she was assigned to a food processing plant, where she worked faithfully for more than 10 years, until the collapse of the union. The combine was drowning in debts, and by the mid-90s finally collapsed. While others ran in panic about tomorrow, Nelly, then still Nelly, quickly realized who takes control of the market and through old connections got a job in a construction company, which was run by brothers. Nelly faithfully kept the books, often received good gifts from the bosses for labor in the form of cognac and expensive foreign candy. Nelly was not ashamed to participate in the dubious affairs of the owners of the company, then secured a spacious 2-room apartment in the center of the city for nothing. Own figures never let her down. She could rely on them and only on them. The dashing 90s were replaced by the new millennium. Gradually, loopholes and holes in the laws and taxation system became less and less. It was no longer possible to pull off the old schemes, and the legitimacy of her employer's business was becoming more and more suspicious. Nelly prudently quit her job when she realized that she smelled a stink and went to work in the university accounting department. The pay there, of course, was more modest, but it was peaceful. Yes, and take a remote maintenance of document management of some small entrepreneurs. No one forbade her. Secretly, of course. The main thing was that the numbers were happy again. Soon Nelly turned into Nelly Smith. She was respected by her colleagues for her acumen, experience, and impeccable professionalism. She was also feared by the students, where Nina Ivanovna taught economics and other specialized disciplines, having quickly received a correspondence pedagogical education. Figures pleased, led her through life, and never once failed. Only in one thing the figures did not help. Nina Ivanovna had no personal life by the age of 60. True, there was a joyous son, Matthew. The woman met his father while she was working for the brothers. It was a visitor from the village, a handsome guy, with a rich imagination, who misled her. A pretty accountant. When Nayli suspected that he was interested in her apartment, specifically the propiska in it, she noisily kicked the suitor out and found out she was pregnant the same week. From a small age Matthew she brought up disciplined, collected and responsible. The boy at the age of 4 could fry eggs, never cried or complained. He graduated from school with a silver medal. Nayli dreamed that her son received a higher education and therefore saved money for it almost from his first grade. And when he passed on the budget, and even at the law school, the woman could not rejoice. Money in one piece, and her son will be a lawyer, as she wanted. Since Matthew's birth, Nayli has never had another serious relationship. She'd had affairs, of course, but it was always numbers that interfered. The beau didn't earn enough. What kind of a man was he who earned less than she did? It's a shame to go out in public with such a man. He wasn't tall enough, or too old, or too young. And constantly it seemed to Nayli that all the gentlemen are trying to steal her living space, gained even if not quite honest, but painstaking labor. In the big city, there are many who want to settle down without much worry at someone else's expense. Nayli was determined not to be that expense. All she cared about were the numbers, the welfare of herself and her son. That evening, Nayli waited for her son to come to dinner, somehow nervously. First she broke a cup, then she scattered salt on the table. The woman was not a superstitious woman, but the resulting mess irritated her. Matthew had shown up at 9 o'clock, cheerful and overjoyed, a vivid expression of emotion he didn't often display. And Nayli didn't welcome such extravaganzas from experience. She knew they usually had 3 reasons, and they were rarely good ones in love, drunk, or an idea that required money. The first had been settled long ago. Matthew was indifferent to that. He wasn't partial to the second one either, so. "Well, tell me what you've already thought up," Nayli asked, looking at her offspring from head to toe through her thin glasses. "What have you thought of, Mom?" Matthew tried to hide his enthusiasm, but it didn't work very well. He was literally bursting with bright colors. "I can't see it," the woman shook her head. Matthew hesitated and sat down on a stool at the table. He knew that, as usual, his mother rejected all his ideas. She thought she knew what was best for her son. No, Matthew was grateful for her sensitivity, but he had never tried to follow her instructions completely. When she forbade him to get a dog as a child, the enterprising Matthew disappeared to the house of his friend Andrew. He did not like his German shepherd Palma, and with the dog Matthew quickly got used to it, even walked with it, gladly replacing the lazy companion. After such walks of her son, Nayli wrinkled her nose, not understanding why suddenly the apartment smelled of dog. In high school, Matthew dreamed of playing the guitar, but Nayli said that the guitar was the domain of idlers. Look at Vysotsky. How much did he accomplish? Mother was wringing her hands in front of her son. But Vysotsky is a legendary man, 16-year-old Matthew parried. A good legend, a circus performer. Nayli spent her life in theaters with her guitar and eventually died at 42. You know why? You should lead a normal life, a serious life. Think about your future promising profession and not play the guitar. Matthew realized that it was useless to argue. His mother's stubbornness was strong. It was a blessing that she worked a lot and was interested only in her son's grades, regimen, and nutrition. Otherwise, Matthew was exempted from the need to report. If they didn't ask, they could. He got an old guitar, found new strings in the morning before dawn, and asked the music teacher to help him with tuning the instrument. In a couple of days, Matthew had a good guitar, though shabby, but it sounded perfect. He played it on camping trips with his class, at first-grade matinees at school, and in Andrew's father's garage. Open fingers he honed in cold water at night. After a few years, however, the love of strings in the guy waned, and the guitar stayed at Andrew's buddy in the garage finally. "Mom, you've been saving money for my education, and I'm studying on a budget." Matthew started from afar. Let's say Nayli raised her right eyebrow. She wasn't wrong again. "I was thinking that I could get a part-time job in the evenings after school. It's about time. I'm 22 soon." Matthew knew just how to placate his mother before revealing his part-time plans. "Who's stopping you?" Nayli agreed, not yet understanding the connection in her son's words. "Well, I got my license in high school, but I haven't had much practice. I have a license, I have free money, I need a car. I'll go to a cab, earn money, and gain experience. You'll always need a car." Matthew exhaled. A car. Then Nayli muttered. Matthew waited breathlessly, like a pigeon, waiting for a handful of grain from its master. Nayli was figuring out what the car gave and what it would require. A vehicle of one's own was a convenience. Meanwhile, age was making itself felt with sore knees, blood pressure, and an increasing need to get around. The money spent on the car will not hit the family budget because it was put aside long ago. But the question of earning money, but let her son earn a penny, but really learn to drive, will become more responsible, as she wanted. The main thing is not to neglect his studies. The figures add up. A car is a necessary thing, unlike a guitar, Nayli said more warmly. Matthew opened his mouth. He was already making backup plans, how to persuade his friend to hide the car at his place, how to deal with the evening absence. And now this was a gift. "Do you mind?" he asked with a smile he couldn't quite contain. "I'm not euphoric, but I support it," Nayli replied graciously. "Just be careful what you buy. Don't get a thank you." He hugged his mother, and happy, jumped into the room. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he did want a part-time job in a taxi cab, but even more than that. Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly. But that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks, you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it, and a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. A cat in a bag. Ask a knowledgeable person for help. And don't try to skip classes and fail your diploma. "Mom, I know," Matthew reassured her. "Thank you." He hugged his mother and jumped into the room happy. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he really did want a part-time job in the cab business. But even more than that, Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly, but that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it, and a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. Matthew stood in front of his mother, almost crying, and she lectured him that studying was more important than relationships with girls. The boy wanted to spite his mother by continuing to date the girl of his choice. But Nayli did her best. She found the phone number of the girl's parents and strictly informed them that their daughter was distracting Matthew from his studies. The unyielding tone of the chief accountant put all the dots on I. Matthew had been shunned by a former friend at school. Nayli thought she was doing the right thing, because her own life had never been about the joys of love, only problems and nerves. Why waste precious time on such nonsense? First you have to achieve something, make a reputation, learn, and then look for a suitable couple. And only one that would suit her, Nayli, completely. And some empty-headed girl to stop her Matthew from moving forward. No. Matthew quietly hated his mother's position, but there wasn't much he could do about it. He realized it was useless to argue with her. He had to maintain a secret private life. However, whether it was his aura or Nayli's invisible hand of protection that stretched far away, every new girl did not stay with him for long. At the institute, a quiet horror began around Matthew. Everyone knew where his mother worked, and among graduate students and faculty, gossip spread at the speed of light. And every new girlfriend of her son, the overbearing accountant and part-time faculty member, crucified her classes as best she could. And if she couldn't do it herself, she asked her colleagues to do it for a small favor. One student, Nayli, and her comrades were so driven to such an extent that the poor girl transferred to another university. Matthew eventually realized that if you look for a friend, then outside the institute, where you can hide her from her mother as much as possible. Nothing good came out of this idea. His mother could detect the girl's presence near him by the smell of perfume. She called him if he was late after class. Matthew couldn't get out much, as Nayli encouraged only academic zeal or rare friendships. The shadow of his mother, always invisibly standing behind the young lawyer's back, frightened the girls, and they quickly severed relations with him. Of course, no one wanted to have such a principled and intrusive mother-in-law. Tiana stood in front of the restaurant manager, her tear-red eyes drooping to the floor. For the third time this week, Gavin was sternly reprimanding the waitress just around the corner from the kitchen. "Third time this week you've gotten on my nerves and made me look like an idiot in front of my guests," he said. "But I didn't mean to. I was pushed," the girl tried to justify herself. "We all don't want something. Tiana, you didn't want to break glasses on Monday? You didn't want to forget the dirty rag on the hall table on Wednesday? Didn't want to spill wine on our regular guest today?" The manager folded his arms and lowered his voice, instilling a faint hope in Tiana's heart. "I'll be more careful, honestly, I promise." Gavin sighed irritably. "Promise your mom you'll be back by 11 p.m., and I'll have to fire you. Employees like you are a loss and a disgrace to the establishment. You'll take the money you earned today as a paycheck for your shift and get out of here." Tiana opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes stung even more. The manager left. The girl worked a few more hours, despite the dislike of the restaurant's customers. She changed her clothes, stuffed a few bills into the pocket of her cloak, and slipped out of the service exit in a shadow. Only on the street did Tiana allow herself to cry. She had been used to the fact that nothing in life was easy since she was a little girl. Tiana had lost her parents early and knew how hard it was to earn a penny for bread. When she was 7, her family and little brother died in a fire. Nothing was left of the household. The frightened little girl was taken in by an elderly neighbor, Aunt Lexi. She raised the girl, gave her everything she could. But Aunt Lexi could not do much to feed, to drink, to love, and only that. The neighbor's modest money was not enough for beautiful clothes, toys, or sweets. People in the village do not live poorly at all. Tiana helped her mother as much as she could. She took care of the garden and a small farm with a dozen chickens while she was at school. From a small age, Tiana knew how to do everything around the house, cooking and baking. After school, she stayed with Aunt Lexi, even though she insisted on sending her to get an education. "How could I leave you? Aunt Tiana was carefully smoothing the corner of the pillowcase with an old iron. "Come on, Tiana," Aunt Lexi sat in the chair next to her. "I'm not going anywhere. And you need to get on with your life. You're not going to be cleaning up after me forever." We had this conversation many times. Auntie was cheerful, but Tiana could see that she was finding it harder and harder to do her usual housework every month. In the end, the girl insisted that her aunt go to the city and be examined. The doctors prescribed heart medication and monthly routine checkups. Seeing the prices at the pharmacy, Tiana just splashed her hands. And then she realized that she had to leave after all to move to the city and work so that her aunt could be treated. Without education, it was hard for a girl to find a job, and she had to live somewhere else. On weekends, she took the train to the village to visit her Aunt Lexi. Tiana rented a tiny dorm room on the edge of town and got a job as a cleaner in a shopping center. Things went well at first, but one day she tripped and a bucket of water spilled out. As a result, one of the stores was left without lights and customers for 2 days. Tiana was fired without pay. The girl did not grieve long and decided to try to work as a nanny in a recruitment agency. They looked squeamishly at her manicure-less hands, dirty from working in the vegetable garden and scrubbing floors, and said, "We've looked at your nails and we're asking you to leave." Tiana sighed, but these very dirty by the standards of city ladies' hands did not put down. She started handing out leaflets and newspapers. True, the income from such work was quite modest. Once in those very newspapers, she saw an ad that the restaurant requires an assistant waiter, dishwasher. She was accepted without much questioning, was given gloves, a sponge, and told to start work the same day. For 2 months, the girl worked hard, washed and rubbed glasses, washed plates and pans to a shine. One day in the restaurant, a waitress did not come out. The manager burst into the kitchen, took a quick look at Tiana, told her to change, put on an apron, and go out into the hall to serve the guests. The first few days were hard, but the girl took to the task diligently. She quickly mastered the simple craft of waitressing. "You're fast," Gavin once told her. "It would be easier for me to hire a granny at the car wash than to look for an adequate employee in the hall." Things were going well at first, with customers leaving good tips. Tiana bought herself some decent clothes, sent more money to the village, some guests, and a supply of medicine for her aunt. And then the black streak began. Then that rag absent-mindedly forgotten in a hurry on one of the tables. Then broken dishes. And now a guest poured wine on the table, and finally Tiana was fired. The girl walked down the night street, wiping her tears. The most frustrating thing was that she had already thought that everything was getting better, spent all the money and did not pay for the room on time. And the owners were waiting for payment and were already looking askew at the young tenant. When Tiana got home, she found another surprise. Her belongings had been piled carelessly into a gym bag and put out into the hallway with an obvious hint. There was no more strength to cry. The paycheck for one shift wouldn't be enough to pay for a month in advance. Tiana didn't grovel after being evicted in absentia. The girl grabbed her bag by the handles, unhooked her keys from the keychain, placed them on the bollard next to her, and left. The penetrating October wind blew in her face. She would walk to the train station, and there she would take the first train in the morning to her aunt's village. Cry quietly into her pillow at night, and try again. Each time, though, it was harder and harder, but the health of her family man was more precious to Tiana. Matthew was in a great mood. He had done a good job today. Outside the window, the streetlights, the bright signs, the neon lights of the city in the rain seemed to flow with color. It was even brighter. At night, from the beginning of the shift, the work went as smoothly as possible. There were expensive orders and interesting passengers. Until 6, Matthew discussed with a philosophy professor, laughed with animators in costumes, drove 2 elderly girlfriends to the theater. The guy liked to drive around the city. He felt free and relaxed. Of course, there were some silent passengers, but for some reason they were a minority. The atmosphere in the car apparently disposed even the hardened silent ones to talk. By midnight, the downpour had intensified. Matthew dropped off the last passenger at the edge of town, near the private sector, and decided that it was time to call it a day. He made a leisurely stop at a gas station, picked up a coffee and a sandwich, tipped the gas station attendant, and headed home in a melancholy mood. There were hardly any people on the streets at this late hour, so Matthew was surprised to see a girl walking along the curb. She was soaked through, She was carrying a heavy sports bag in her hands, and her cloak was useless. "Young lady, what are you doing?" "Get in. I'll give you a ride home." The guy stopped and opened the door from the passenger side. "And I have nowhere to go." He heard a completely broken voice. "I don't have a home here, but let me take you somewhere." "The weather's terrible," Matthew insisted. "It's free." He suddenly felt surprisingly sorry for the girl. Not because she was walking alone at night in a downpour, but because Matthew felt a silent call for help. The kind of call you might read in the eyes of a puppy abandoned in a box. "Sit down, please." "I can't leave you here at a time like this." Matthew emphasized the word please very strongly. "The stranger," he thought, sighed. Then she skipped over a puddle by the curb and grabbed the door handle. They drove in silence for a while. Matthew turned on the heater to warm the shivering passenger. "How did you end up here?" The boy was the first to ask, and Tiana told him. It was as if she had been saving it all up for months, and now she was out of control. She talked, and Matthew listened until he realized she was crying. "You'll forgive me for sitting here crying like this. It's a terrible shame for you." A stranger, she apologized confusedly as the car stopped at a stoplight. Instead of answering, Matthew pulled some tissues out of the glove compartment. "But why a stranger?" "My name is Matthew." He held out a paper handkerchief to the girl with a smile. "Tanya," she sobbed in response. "Well, now we know each other. Would you like some coffee or tea?" Tanya had no time to answer, as he stopped at another gas station and disappeared in the doorway. 5 minutes later, he handed the girl a hot cup, a small chocolate bar, and threw his jacket from the back seat over her shoulders. They pulled off to the pad to the side. Matthew tried to lighten the mood as best he could, even trying some awkward jokes. This girl's story seemed to him like a mockery of fate, and at the same time he felt a desire to help. It was strange. Matthew wouldn't call himself sentimental or tearful. He didn't give money to beggars, and he wasn't Benjamin. "And now I have nowhere to go. I can hardly afford a hotel. I don't know much about the city." Tanya finished her story, warming her fingers on a hot drink. "Please bring me to the station. If you don't mind, I'll wait for the train there." "You'll freeze at the station in your wet clothes. Stay at my place, and tomorrow I'll take you to the station," Matthew said. The words came out of his mouth before he could think about it. He didn't think about his mother or morality at that moment. He wanted from the bottom of his heart to do something good for his accidental passenger. Tanya froze and for the first time truly stared at Matthew in amazement. He nodded silently, with a slight smile, confirming his offer. And Tanya suddenly agreed. Tired, wet, exhausted, she figured she simply had nothing to lose, and so be it. That late evening, Matthew spoke to his mother in a way he had never spoken to her before. Nayli, of course, was against the idea of her apartment acting as a lodging house for unemployed women. However, for the first time, her son did not ingratiate himself to her or ask for permission, but spoke in a voice as firm as a rock. Nayli felt a chill run down her spine. So different from the Matthew she was used to. "She'll clean herself up, and I'll see her off tomorrow morning," he said. "Don't embarrass yourself, Mom. If you can't kick the poor girl out, you'll only embarrass yourself in front of her and the neighbors." Matthew firmly contradicted his mother once more and went downstairs to the car to fetch Tiana. Nayli was quietly seething, but for some reason she couldn't object. Had something about him changed that evening? Something that made the woman, against her will, look at her son differently. The university's chief accountant defiantly closed herself in her bedroom and turned off the lights. Matthew put Tiana in his room and moved to the sofa in the living room. The girl's wet clothes were hung on the backs of chairs and radiators. "Good night to you, Tiana," he said as he closed the door. "Good night to you too." "Thank you," the girl replied, lay back on her pillow, closed her eyes, and for the first time in many days truly smiled. Matthew stood outside the door, wondering what had happened to him today. Was it an attack of pity, compassion, an outburst of emotion, or had his soul reached out to someone unfamiliar but dear, someone in need of protection and care? Early in the morning, Nayli got ready for work. She was offended by her son's behavior. To prove it, she had gotten up at the crack of dawn and decided to go to the university herself, though she was used to Matthew driving her. But principle and resentment were dearer. Nayli examined her guest's old-fashioned coat on the rack by the bathroom, then glanced even more squeamishly at the stale, dirty sneakers. Things in the hallway hinted that she was not noted for her tidiness, her limited means. The woman stepped over the stranger's shoes, deciding to wash the hallway with bleach upon her return, and left. The young men awoke almost simultaneously. Matthew saw through the doorway as Tiana timidly tried to find the bathroom. It was not without some awkwardness. Matthew, like a hospitable host, had even made breakfast. But it was made of sandwiches and tea early in the morning, when he himself dropped the unpretentious dishes. The sandwich landed sausage side down and landed on Tiana's pant leg with a piece of butter. The young people stared at the sad piece of salami on the plate for a few seconds, and then laughed. Matthew felt so relaxed and at the same time at ease with this girl that he hadn't even noticed his mother's absence from the morning. Of course, any awkwardness was gone from the conversation. "Are you on your way to the station?" he asked. They chatted like old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. Tiana had forgotten all about what had happened to her yesterday. It was sunny, just like this sunny city. She told her sudden companion about her childhood at her aunt's house, about how she liked to pick dandelion bouquets in the vegetable garden, about the time she was pecked by a rooster, about her first for dictation. There was no sadness or longing in these stories, only carefree childhood and sincere delight of a child. Matthew listened eagerly, attentive to every word, absorbing these pure emotions, which he almost never got from his mother. With her commanding temperament, she was always dry, not praising, not encouraging, not interested in her son's dreams and discoveries. Nayli was preoccupied with the primary worldly tasks: food, regimen, studies, profession, finances. Matthew had enough friends. Teachers at school loved him. Girls were not shy to make eyes at him. But all this was a trifle compared to what this 19-year-old girl from the village told him today. With simplicity, purity, and trust. They waited for the train together, sitting on the platform. "Thank you very much." "I don't know how to thank you," Tiana said again with some awkwardness as she said goodbye. "It's okay," Matthew dismissed her. "But I do. Let's meet again when you get back and go to the movies." Tiana was a girl from the countryside who had come to the city. She met Matthew and a warm friendship developed between them. Matthew was charmed by Tiana's openness, spontaneity, and cheerfulness, something he lacked in his relationship with his own strict mother, Nayli. When Tiana was leaving, Matthew suggested that they meet again when she came to town and go to a movie. Tiana was happy at the prospect. Upon returning home, Matthew faced the displeasure of Nayli's mother, who considered Tiana a country wench and tried to get rid of any trace of her in the apartment with bleach. A conflict arose, during which Matthew for the first time openly confronted his mother, tired of her excessive control over his life. This situation highlighted the overdue contradictions between Matthew and his mother Nayli. On the one hand, Nayli cared for her son, but at the same time she was overprotective and tried to impose her rigid attitudes on him. And Matthew, having met Tiana, felt a longing for freedom, lightness, and spontaneity in relationships. This story touches on the themes of growing up, gaining independence, the value of simple human joys, and the ability to assert one's boundaries even in relationships with loved ones. The clash of two life philosophies caused a generational conflict between mother and son. "I'm sick of your control," said Nayeli. "I see you've picked up a lot of chutzpah from that hillbilly too." "Better chutzpah than a lifetime of being told what to do by someone else," Matthew said, and slammed the front door so hard that the figurines fell from the table. He slept in the car that night. Such loud arguments with his mother had never happened before. The boy had always held back or avoided sharp edges with cunning, but now something had been hurt that didn't want to put up with the insults. Tiana didn't tell her aunt what had happened. She said she was just visiting for a few days. The perceptive relative immediately noticed that her stepdaughter was unusually joyful. "But Tiana, tell me, did you meet someone?" Aunt Lexi asked at dinner. The girl burst out in surprise and dropped her spoon into her plate, splashing the table. Aunt Lexi laughed. "Ouch. You don't have to answer that. I can already see that I've met a handsome man." Tiana told her named mother about Matthew. The main thing is that the man is good. You don't see much selfless help these days." Aunt Lexi patted her stepdaughter's shoulder approvingly. "Auntie, I don't think I'm right for him," Tiana said. "And anyway, maybe that's true. I was already dreaming of a house with a rose garden. And if you don't dream, then why live?" The woman was genuinely surprised. "You should have fallen in love a long time ago. In my childhood, there was only school, vegetable garden, chickens. I'm old, you'll be sitting on my neck." "But Auntie, don't say that," Tiana objected. "Who else but me will help you? Youth is for dreaming, for joy, for falling in love. And you are doing a great deal for me. Go and meet him, and I'll give you something to dress up." Aunt Lexi got up and went into her room. From there she heard the noise and creaking of an old closet. Soon the woman returned with 2 stud earrings. "This is what my late husband Alex gave me for my wedding in 1973. Ural emerald, a good luck stone." She placed the jewelry in the palm of the amazed Tiana's hand. The earrings were small, but elegant, even noble. The light green stone played in the sun, shimmering with facets. Aunt Lexi easily pushed Tiana to the mirror to try on the gift, and it was as if the jewelry was made for the girl. The emerald earrings looked even more beautiful against her brown hair. "Well, what's not a bride to be?" "Well done," Aunt Lexi said with a pat on the knee. Tiana laughed and took another sneak peek at herself in the reflection. That same night, Matthew called her himself. They chatted about everything and nothing. For about half an hour, the guy said he'd meet her at the train station. Also that he had a surprise. Tiana exhaled, awkwardly said goodbye, and went to bed, gazing dreamily at the fishnet shadows on the ceiling. Matthew did apologize to Nayli's mother for being rude when he cooled down. Still, the heated atmosphere in the apartment was hitting a nerve. It was amazing how Matthew had been practicing law at the university, operating with articles and laws, arguing with his professors, but he had been unable to defend his opinion to his mother until that day, because she had built her unquestionable rightness and authority into his head. Nayli listened to her son's apology and pretended to accept it too. But the coolness of the relationship betrayed the truth. Perhaps she was a little more critical of her son than usual, as if she were getting back at him for the offense. And he seemed impenetrably indifferent. About his studies, about cars, about passengers at work. Fears and worries. The invisible grit, he shook off his shirt and adjusted the collar of his coat. A worm of worry coiled inside Nayli. Had something changed? Whereas before she could confidently say she knew her Matthew from the get-go, now she couldn't. He was with her, and not with her at the same time. She'd been tempted to ask her son about her concerns several times, but she didn't know how to begin. The control she'd built her life around had been broken. The day of their second meeting was unusually warm for October. The sun was so hot that Tiana had taken off her cloak and was carrying it in her hands. Matthew even wore dark sunglasses, though he hid his eyes, which kept looking at the girl, her hair, her figure, her eyes, the polka dots on her blouse, the neat earrings. Every detail Matthew wanted to memorize and keep. In 3 days he'd missed her so much it felt like they hadn't seen each other in forever. "So what's the surprise?" Tiana asked, tucking an embarrassed strand behind her ear. Matthew nodded enigmatically and took her hand, calmly and confidently at the same time. In that gesture, all the worry, fuss, and concern dissolved. They walked down a long alley littered with yellow maple leaves and found themselves in a pet store. "Do you want to get me a hamster?" Tiana laughed. Matthew only smiled again. "Look here for a moment," he said, and disappeared behind the racks of aquariums. Tiana looked at the strange fish, the funny guinea pigs, and the noisy parrots. She liked the atmosphere, and she had always loved animals. She used to feed the chickens from her hands as a little girl, stroking their feathers, but they only clucked and looked into her face with their bird eyes. Tiana was distracted from her thoughts when through the bars she was playing with a parrot, as green as a young pea. "I see you've already got the hang of it. You've got the hang of it," joked a small woman in an apron with the store's emblem. "Hello, Tiana. My name is Olivia. Can it be Olivia? Matthew told me you were looking for a job." "Aunt Olivia is my best friend Alex's mom," Matthew explained. "And she'd love to have you if you'd like to work for her, of course." Tiana couldn't believe her ears with joy. Yes, I agree. I'm ready to start today," she blurted out. Olivia laughed. That's the spirit. But today is not necessary. In 2 or 3 days, find a place to live, and then call me. She handed Tiana her business card, confused and happy at the same time. Matthew had a few words with the friendly pet store owner, and they walked out. This is the second time you've helped me? I already feel very uncomfortable about it, Tiana said. The girl looked at Matthew. I didn't do anything, she said, jokingly raising her hands. A car brought you home to me, and Aunt Oberon took you to work. Of course she did, Tiana laughed and poked Matthew in the side with a finger of poorly hidden pride. Matthew whooped and laughed and immediately started tickling Tiana in return. They ran down the street like fools, one after another, giggling like schoolboys. Passers-by turned to look at the strange couple. But for them, the world gradually shrank to just each other. Would you point your finger at me again if I said I'd help you a third time? Matthew asked when they were out of breath. Tiana opened her mouth but said nothing. Let's go somewhere, Matthew suggested. And then we can go to the movies. I think we can make it in time. He looked at his wristwatch. 15 minutes later, the boys pulled up in front of the university dormitory. Matthew was friends with the head of the group, and he got along with the commandant. A small gift, a thank you envelope, a story about a poor relative, and he agreed to let the pseudo-student stay for a month or two. All the more so because Tiana's age was more than suitable. However, the commandant asked her to keep out of sight of the teachers and to come before 22. Are you a wizard, honestly? Tiana stared at Matthew as they walked outside with the room key. The boy scrutinized his chin and the back of his head, and then stated with a very serious look. So no beard, like Hotabike. The magic hat is also missing. Verdict? No, I'm not a wizard. Matthew leaned over to Tiana and whispered conspiratorially. Well, maybe a little. He made her laugh playfully and cleverly solved in one-day problems that took her weeks to solve. It was beginning to seem to her that the fairy tales her aunt had told her as a child were coming true. Let's hurry, Matthew took her hand again, firm and gentle at the same time. We have a movie starting in 20 minutes. It was one of the most joyous days of Matthew's life in recent memory. Yes, he'd skipped class today. Yes, he wouldn't go to work tonight. Yes, his mother would freak out if she found out. But why? Right now he feels needed and happy. And happiness is definitely worth a couple unattended lectures and a few missed passengers. Nayli tapped her pencil nervously on her desk. She had given the students an assignment. They sat like mice and wrote, while the instructor was lost in her own thoughts. 15 minutes ago, the department told her that Matthew had skipped class. He hadn't been in class before or after lunch. The helpful group supervisor had even asked Nayli if her son was all right. The woman threw something discreet in response, but inside her a mixture of resentment, frustration, and intense misunderstanding was slowly simmering. Matthew didn't pick up his phone and turned it off altogether. When had she not seen him treat her like that? So what if he became an adult? A mother should be respected at any age. She wants what's best for him to have a future, to become a powerful man, to make a name and a career. Where did it all start? Well, I guess it started with the unfortunate car. Yeah, that was a mistake. She let him, it was her own fault, believing a young man's good intentions. And now she's looking for him in that car. He's out of control. He feels he can do anything. So we've got to get rid of her as soon as possible. And Matthew can go back to being a good student and a good son. And if he wants to work, he can be a paralegal. You can't trust a man, even if it is your own child. She knows what's best. She's lived her life and managed to settle down well only because of her savvy, calculating, and pragmatic nature. So she can beat the crap out of a young guy's head. He'll thank her later, when his classmates are trampling the training ground in their boots. It's Daddy's bad blood. Nayli remembered her father. He, too, had been doing things during their short relationship. At first she'd even liked it, but then it became clear that without organization and discipline, nothing good would come of it. And a little later the beau made it clear what he really wanted. He was noodling about eternal love, encouraging Nayli to register him at her place. She couldn't let Matthew, whom she'd raised all her life, suddenly turn off the well-thought-out path. The weeds of excessive freedom, dubious girlfriends, and the like must be pulled out at the root. The chief accountant was distracted from his thoughts by a call from the class. The students hurriedly began to hand in their papers. Nayli didn't even glance at the stack of papers that piled up in the corner of her desk a couple minutes later. In her mind, she was already creating a plan to save her son and get him back on track. Matthew had come home in a light, uplifted mood, and that made the air sparkle. Nayli's mood was diametrically opposed. "Matthew, is there anything you want to tell me?" she asked, as soon as his son entered the kitchen and began to pour his tea. "No, Mom. Nothing yet." He smiled radiantly at his mother from the other end of the kitchen. "So skipping class isn't enough reason to talk." Nayli tried to hold back the outrage that was bursting out of her. Matthew's hand hovered in the air, a teaspoonful of sugar. He exhaled, then carefully poured the sugar into the cup and stirred the contents leisurely. "Mom, I'm a grown man. If there are tales on my studies from my absence, I'll deal with them myself. Don't be so nervous." Nayli's calm, measured tone made her son's voice boil even more. "Why are you embarrassing me? Do you want people to point the finger at me for having a truant son?" "No, Mom, you want to make a big deal out of nothing. One day of absenteeism is not the disaster you pictured." Matthew still spoke firmly and calmly, though it cost him some effort. For some reason, after talking to Jenny, he felt more mature, stronger, more confident. The weight that had been weighing on his shoulders since childhood and preventing him from objecting to his parent had dissolved into oblivion. With absenteeism, everything begins. Then women, then stupid adventures. Before you know it, you'll be without a diploma, without a profession, and without a decent place in life, Nayli said. "Mom, stop making such a big deal out of it, please." Matthew sighed tiredly and rubbed his temples. The lightness and the wonderful impression of the day were gone because of this inane interrogation. Nayli, like a horse that had been yanked backwards at the most crucial moment, felt the invisible thread of her control over her son fleeing further and further ahead. "Tell me, why did you skip your classes?" the woman asked. "I went to get my car repaired," Matthew replied. He realized that the truth would make his mother even more furious, so he said the first thing that came into his head. "You think I can't see you're lying?" Nayli threw the towel over her shoulder and put her hands to her sides. "What car?" "I'm old, Matthew, but I'm not crazy." "I've been fixing the car," the guy said expressively, separating his words with pauses. "Give me the keys," Nayli demanded. "I bought this car for you, and I'll take it back." What happened next broke some shudder in the woman's mind. Matthew silently pulled a bundle from his pocket, unhooked the alarm keys from it, and placed them in his mother's palm. Nayli stared at them stupidly somehow. The emotional army looked out from behind them confusedly, not realizing where the enemy had gone. "Take it. Only you can't drive." "That's one thing." Matthew began to curl his fingers defiantly. "You can't sell it without the owner's signature." "Me, that's two. In the end, your money, as you say, will rot in the yard, or will become the prey of car thieves when they find a car without an owner for several months. That's three." Nayli stared at him in amazement, gulping for air. Matthew calmly took the keys. Then he came very close and said quietly but seriously, "Don't forget who I'm studying for, even if I occasionally skip classes." The guy took a mug of tea from the table and left the kitchen. The incident was over. The first stage of Nayli's plan had collapsed like a house of cards. She didn't like the job. For the first few weeks, she'd come to it as if it were an out-of-the-way place. Oberon marveled at how quickly the girl grasped everything and even did more on instinct. But the village childhood and her experience in caring for animals had its effect. Tiana quickly realized that she loved these hamsters, and what treats can only be given to parrots. In one day, she sorted through a warehouse of pet food. Then she cleaned 2 old aquariums to a shine which were dusty in the back room. "Well done," praised her store owner. "You can buy new fish if there is room." Tiana was not tired in the slightest. The work did not exhaust her as before. In the evening, she came to the dormitory, read books, or looked for information about her furry feathered charges on the net. She didn't want to collapse on the bed and fall asleep. This peculiar training has borne fruit. The customers listened to the girl enthusiastically. When they faced the choice of buying a pet, Tiana sat little mice in the arms of children, showed how to properly catch fish with a net from the aquarium, explained how to teach parrots to talk. Oberon could not be pleased with such a smart and diligent worker. Tiana herself was quietly pleased. She was afraid to rejoice loudly. Everything was going too well in her life. She was used to breaking through, climbing, gnawing her teeth with tears in her eyes. And her aunt said that there were plenty of envious eyes around, and they were not even necessarily acquaintances. That's how you rejoice, and some offended by life lady on the street spit and wishes you nasty things. So it is better to be quiet, but be sure that happiness will not go anywhere. The girl told me how she had settled down. She unobtrusively asked about Matthew, but Tiana did not refuse. They saw each other 2 or 3 times a week. Matthew would stop by her place of work before his shift in a cab. They would sit in the corner of the store like a pair of canaries. Oberon had once scolded Matthew for interfering with Tiana's work, but then waved it off, seeing the boys' glances at each other. Tiana hated to let him go every time, but she was afraid to say so. The range of emotions around Matthew was off the charts. She felt like a fool when he explained some historical facts with an important look. Then she was embarrassed and blushed. If he brought her goodies and small nice gifts, she sank in his eyes as in a cup of fragrant tea. Once he waited for her after the store closed. They drove around town all evening, and then Matthew handed her a neat bouquet. Never had any man treated her so simply and tenderly at the same time, not counting her aunt. But here was different. There was care, a twinge of shyness, a fear of offending, a desire to protect and shelter her under his wing. Tiana could feel it all without words. She'd once tried to start a conversation about thanking him for helping her with her job and housing. But Matthew put his finger to his lips and smiled. She was drawn to him more and more each day. When Tiana went to the village, she missed him especially. She wanted to put her arms around him, snuggle her nose into his chest, and be silent. Smiling in love, she finally remembered that you can live and work not only for someone or for the sake of someone, but also just for yourself. Of course, Tiana never stopped sending her aunt money and worrying about her health. But for the first time, she realized that she could exhale and slow down a bit. That there were simple everyday joys, that you didn't have to run ahead, and sometimes you could even let yourself relax. October was over, and rainy, cold November came, followed by December. But not everyone was in the same gloomy mood. In Matthew's mind, the sun was shining all the time, whether he was in classes or driving to work. Time dragged on, but with Tiana, it flew by like a blink. His mother was behind him, or pretended to be. He didn't really care. Matthew didn't respect or love her any less. He just realized it was time to protect his personal space. Funny how it was only meeting the girl from the village that put things in perspective. Before, he had waited anxiously for his parents' approval and worried about her every no, even though he found an alternative. Matthew also realized that his mother would definitely not approve of his affair with Tiana. Not now, anyway. That's why he hid the girl's presence in every possible way. Why create unnecessary conflicts? When the time came, he'd introduce them for real. Toward the end of the year, every accountant is overwhelmed. You have to make reports, summarize all the documents, add up debit and credit. And, as is always the case, some certificates and forms were missing. Nayli had to send a couple of graduate students to lead the way, and herself to search for the necessary papers. She preferred to do everything in advance. There were enough examples around of those who procrastinated until the last-minute, sleepy students turning in their tails, and young professors cursing the university's bureaucratic system while trying to fill out all the journals in a day before an audit. Why do people have such a lack of respect for numbers? After all, you just have to start and everything in life goes according to plan. Someone will stop being late, someone will find out where most of their money goes, and someone will make an informed decision, Nayli thought. On their head, like a perfectionist, everything was in order. Accounting, Alex's student house. Matthew's shelf was empty. Outwardly, everything was the same, and she couldn't charge anything to her son based on maternal suspicion alone. But that same instinct told her that her son had changed. More precisely, he stopped listening to her. Break. All the shelves in the study. Nayli realized she had to go to the university dormitory. The necessary documents were bound to be there with the commandant. At first, Nayli had thought of sending a young assistant to the dormitory, but then something compelled her to go herself. And, as it turned out, for good reason. As soon as she came around the corner, she saw a familiar car in the parking lot in front of the dormitory. Matthew was standing next to it, reverently embracing a girl in an unremarkable gray jacket, but with a bright green scarf. The head accountant lurked around the corner like a detective. Then she took out her cell phone and snapped a couple of pictures. "So this is the mouse responsible for all my son's changes," the woman whispered, peering at Tiana through the panes of her glasses. At first, Nayli wanted to give her offspring a beating right there in the parking lot. But experience told her to be more subtle. She'd already kept more than one skirt away from her boy. It would be easy to deal with a skirt like that. Nayli even hid her face from all pictures of her son. It seemed to her the most disgusting prank. The woman waited until the couple had left, and with a determined look, she made her way to the commandant's office. "First, I decided to get all the necessary paperwork, and then to nail the guardian of the peace of the dormitory to the wall with personal questions. I've got a truant student who lives here. I want to talk to her." Nayli began from afar as the papers were already in her bag. "Whoever we find will be punished." The commandant, who liked to show off to the faculty on occasion, was keenly interested. True, this did not prevent him from covering student parties and absences for a small payoff. But here's the trouble. I don't remember the name and I've only seen it once, but here's a photo. Help me find this shameless one." Nayli shoved her phone under the commandant's nose, where Tiana's face was clearly visible. He turned up his nose predatorily, but then faltered, like a hound mistaking an empty tin can for a partridge. "Not ours exactly," he shrugged. "What do you say? Why don't you send an inspection down here? Have you had an accounting for a long time?" And repairs. Nayli raised one eyebrow expressively. "I'm a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience." The commandant's eyes flickered. He was choosing the lesser of evils. Considering that some of the public property was written off, or sold, and the pipes and electrics were kept on duct tape and word of honor, he didn't need any inspections. To get the full because of the mess in the dormitory, or to get a little because of the lieutenant, the choice was obvious. "But actually," said the commandant, "she lives in room 302, but it is temporary, at the request of a relative from the village." Only then he realized that the girl in question could not be a student, which meant that she had not been truant. But it was too late. "Apparently the law doesn't apply to you," said Nayli. Apparently an audit wouldn't hurt after all. The head accountant adjusted her glasses, turned to the door, and walked out. By evening, Nayli knew everything about Tiana: who she was, where she came from, what she was doing in the dormitory, and how she had gotten there. The story of a village girl with no education who was trying desperately to get a foothold in the city had set things straight. The woman realized that she was not wrong in her premonitions. She made a couple of calls and hung up the receiver of the working landline phone on the lever in satisfaction. Matthew looked at the time. It was almost 7 p.m. Tiana would be finishing work in half an hour. The young people agreed to go for a walk. The weather was just right. It was snowing without wind. The city seemed to be covered with a downy shawl. The guy took a couple of cups of coffee, Tiana's favorite chocolate, and went along a familiar route. But going into the store, saw instead of Joy crying girl and consoling her Oberon. "Nothing, Tianushka. I can wait until you get settled again." The kind pet store owner stroked Tiana's back. "What's wrong?" Matthew rushed over to them, not forgetting his coffee, which he nearly spilled. "Everything's gone. They evicted me from the dormitory." Tiana wiped away her tears. "They said only students could live there." "Well, why am I surprised? I'm the one who sat down." Matthew berated himself. "You should have found another place to live a long time ago. Where's the stuff? Is it in the warehouse over there?" Oberon nodded at the door behind the cash register. "It's not your fault," Tiana said. "I'm the one who got too relaxed. Let's go. Let's try to do something." Matthew took the bags from behind the door. "Aunt Abby, if Tiana doesn't work for a couple of days, nothing will happen." "Oh, come on, Matthew." The woman waved her hand. "Well, I'm not human, am I? Of course I'll wait. Besides, you can't throw away such workers." Tiana looked at her employer with grateful eyes, and then at Matthew, who was already holding her jacket. "Come on, Eagles, you've got work to do." Oberon admonished them before they left. The snow was still circling in the air, falling carelessly, dancing. Next to Matthew, Tiana immediately became calmer. He certainly wouldn't let her stay out at night. They got into the car, stowed their bags. "We'll check into a hotel tonight, and tomorrow we'll find you an apartment," he said. "But let's stop by my place. I think I left my car papers in my room. If the police stop me, I don't want to pay a fine." "Sure, let's go." Tiana nodded and unconsciously hugged Matthew's arm. While they reached their destination, they called several hotels and very soon found a free and inexpensive room. They could exhale a little. As the car pulled into the driveway, Tiana's cell phone suddenly rang. She thought that it was the hotel receptionist, so she picked up the phone without looking at the screen. After a couple of minutes, the phone slipped out of her hands and fell on the seat. "What? Who called?" Matthew saw Tiana sit up with a determined face and saw her eyes fill with tears again. "Auntie's been taken to the hospital," Tiana muttered with wooden lips. It was the neighbor who called the ambulance. Matthew pulled her to him and hugged her. "Why is all this coming down on you?" He stroked her hair and felt her shaking with sobs and tears. And Tiana was crying again, only out of helplessness. She had only just begun to believe in miracles as life brought her harshly back to reality. "Matthew, it's okay. It's going to be okay. Calm down. Let's go to your aunt's." "What hospital did they take her to?" Matthew started fumbling in the armrests. "In the meantime, have a drink. Tears won't help, but your eyes will hurt." He took out a plastic bag of pills and a bottle of mineral water. And then what they call a fatal accident happened. Tiana swallowed the pills and began coughing desperately. Matthew, in a panic, rushed to pound the girl's back and search for water around the car. But there was no more. He realized that just a little more, and they would have to go to the hospital for another reason. There was no choice but to go up to the apartment to get a glass of water. Matthew flew into the kitchen without taking off his shoes and immediately met the surprised gaze of Nayli's mother. All she could see was her son rushing back into the hallway with the hair dryer and the glass, and that there was someone coughing desperately. A few seconds later, the eyes of the unofficial mother-in-law and daughter-in-law met, the former's full of contempt, arrogance, and disgust, the latter's frightened and confused. "Why did you bring this here?" Nayli didn't even bother to call Tiana anything other than it. "Mom, can't you see? Is she sick?" Matthew stood up for his friend. "I see." The chief accountant wrinkled her nose squeamishly. "And she wants to get a better job at your expense." Matthew stepped between his mother and Tiana. "You've lost the last vestiges of your humanity with your numbers," he said, putting his back to the girl. "No, son. You've lost your mind." Nayli raised her hand and poked Tiana with her finger. "That girl's just a country girl. She'll move in, get pregnant, saddle you up in our apartment, and make money out of you." Tiana felt dizzy, whether from the fact that she could breathe normally at last or from the words of this scary woman hitting her like a rod. "I'd rather lose my mind with her than go on living with you on a leash," Matthew said, pulling Tiana close to him. Matthew turned his back to his outraged mother and hugged Tiana, who was trembling with shock. And out they went. To the hospital, the young people drove in silence. The girl no longer had the strength for emotions, and the guy was ashamed in front of her. In the hospital, Tiana barely made her way through the nurses to Aunt Ida's room. The woman was unexpectedly cheerful and was discussing something with another patient. "Auntie?" Tiana looked at her with a mixture of joy and bewilderment. The old woman went into the cellar and slipped on the last step. I went tumbling. Aunt Ida began to tell her story so contagiously cheerful that everyone present involuntarily smiled. I was sitting on a pile of potatoes. My leg was curled up. Somehow my neck, the crown, and the soup fell out. I got up somehow. Our neighbor went into the barn. I called out to her. And that's how I ended up here. Oh, Aunt Ida. Do you know how to scare? Tiana laughed and hugged the woman. It's a sprain. They put a plaster cast on me, covered the abrasions with green, but left them. Aunt Ida nodded at the pile of papers on the nightstand next to Tiana's familiar mother. Tiana was immediately relieved. She was happy that everything had worked out. Neither lost housing nor nasty words could be more important than the love of those closest to her. Matthew's head poked into the room. He was tired of tramping down the hall. Come in, young man." Aunt Ida waved her hand invitingly, a little embarrassed. "Your guests. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." Tiana introduced them to each other. In a couple of minutes, the conversation was already flowing animatedly. It was so easy and relaxed for all three of them, as if they were not in a hospital room, but on the veranda of a country house on a Saturday sunset. They chatted until the nurse asked the visitors to leave, as the time had passed 22. "We'll come tomorrow," Tiana promised. Come. Just the two of you," Aunt Ida winked at them both approvingly. When Matthew didn't come home the first night, Nayli had treated it as a whim. When Matthew didn't show up the second, third night either, Nayli began to worry. And when one day some of his things disappeared, she realized that the usual order had been broken. In the mind of a woman who had spent her life measuring by numbers, what had happened was incomprehensible. The unfortunate broken cup came to mind. On the fourth day, Nayli caught Matthew in the corridor of the university. "When are you coming home?" she asked him sternly but worriedly. "I'm fine," Mom Matthew replied distantly and coldly. "Don't be nervous." He pulled his elbow out of his mother's palm and headed off to his next class. Matthew and Tiana rented an apartment. A neighbor looked after the household in the village. There, in that tiny room of an old 5-story building, Matthew felt as cozy and good as he had never felt anywhere else. He already knew that this girl would definitely become his wife. Her inner world, her childlike directness, her marvelous sense of beauty charmed him. Her borscht cutlets could compete with restaurant dishes, an affectionate embrace in the evenings energized and relaxed at the same time. Tiana stopped by Aunt Lexi's hospital every day before work. Tiana had a fiancé. Aunt Lexi laughed. "What a fiancé?" Tiana waved away the beet red Tiana. "I'm old, but I'm not bad." "I see that you both bloom like a flower on a May afternoon," the woman said good-naturedly, patting her stepdaughter on the head. Matthew smiled at the words, for they were true. When Aunt Lexi was discharged, the young men took her to the village. The elderly woman, limping but alert, joked constantly. From that day on, Matthew began going to see her with Tiana almost constantly. He liked the village atmosphere, the peace and tranquility. He had never had any relatives in the countryside, so everything was a wonder. The young man looked at the house and yard with keen interest, zealously brushed the snow, and constantly found something to do that required a man's hand. He changed the faucet, insulated the wiring, rehung the doors on the kitchen cabinets. Walk with the one, Aunt Lexi elbowed Tiana while standing in the hallway. "Tired of planting potatoes and digging beds in the spring," Tiana said. "I'd love to." Matthew crawled out from under the sink with a wrench, and Tiana laughed. Periodically, the couple's idyll in the village or in the apartment was broken by Nayli's phone calls. She asked Matthew to come back, shouted at him, threatened him, begged him, but the boy was adamant. Yes, it was hard to combine studying, working in a cab, and traveling out of town. On weekends, I had to deny myself something to pay the rent, but it was better than living under orders and constant control. "Mom, I'm fine." "Don't be so nervous," Matthew answered with the usual phrases without appealing to his conscience. Neither entreaties nor even tears could make him become comfortable and proper by his mother's standards again. In the end, Matthew began to be at home, but for a tick, and kept his new address a secret. He never refused help, but he kept his distance and continued to assert his personal boundaries. Nayli's anger was replaced by jealousy powerlessness, and it flowed into resentment. Colleagues said different things who scolded the village girl, who suggested to get away from his son. But all agreed in one thing: at such a young age, so nervous will not do any good. Several months had passed since mid-April. Spring burst into town with cherry blossoms and the scent of the first daffodils. Nayli, though tired, could not fully accept the fact that her son lived apart. One warm day, when the sun was almost summertime, the accountant returning from work sat down on a bench in the lilac bushes. Usually Nayli never sat on it with her neighbors, considering it beneath her dignity to watch passers-by. But today her new shoes rubbed her foot, and she had no choice. Daniel, an elderly neighbor, came out of the entryway, leaning on a stick. He was a quiet old man who lived on the first floor, tended the flower beds, fed the birds, and never bothered anyone. "It's a beautiful day today," he greeted Nelly, lifting his old-fashioned hat. "Terrible. My feet are all blistered," she mumbled back. "My son's been on my nerves since winter. Work's a mess. It's not beautiful. Feet will heal. Work is not a wolf. And I can fix my son," Daniel shouted and went about his business. He left his mother. Dumped her, Nelly grumbled. "I was like you when I was young." Nelly, the neighbor, suddenly changed his tone. "I also scolded my daughter for falling in love early. She married a tailor instead of a military man." Nelly, who had a lot of unfriendly thoughts swirling around in her head, suddenly had them scattering like sparrows from a bush. And nothing. She's graduated from the institute, teaches dancing to kids. Happy. Her eyes are shining. And now I'm happy about my granddaughter, Nelly. I took her to the circus when she was little. Now she's running from school with a certificate. Grandpa. She's all grown up now." Daniel sat down on the bench next to Nelly. "What does this have to do with my son?" she asked in bewilderment. "It has to do with the fact that you have to let your children go in time, that you can't make a bed for them everywhere, so let them make their own mistakes and learn their own way. You want it better, but can he have it better in his head?" The old man looked at Nelly carefully. "How could he know?" the woman began. The old man interrupted her and looked into her eyes clearly, but slightly sternly. "Do you want to see your grandchildren?" There was something in that look that made Nelly's inner rebel surrender, embarrassed, hide in a far corner. "I do," she said, barely audibly. "And if you keep fighting with your son, you won't see it." Daniel folded his hands on the hilt of his cane. "It's about time he flew out of the nest and made his own. Is he a boy? Let's go." Nelly sighed. The elderly neighbor simply and without ceremony revealed the truth that she had feared all her life and did not want to admit that her son would grow up sooner or later, that he would not replace her husband. Life really isn't just about numbers and controlling every event around her. Nelly turned all suitors away, fearing they would take up her living space, and ended up alone. She drove the girls away from her son, and he still chose the one he liked. She did not spare even the students, even though they diligently studied her subjects and were afraid of absences. She only pointed, controlled, criticized, seeking to fill the void in her own soul. No matter how you look at it, it's a beautiful day. Daniel drew in air noisily and shouted happily, pointing to a tree. "Look, a tit." He watched the bird with interest. Nelly nodded and smiled. The black and white bird hopped about the branches with a stick in its beak. At one point it dropped its find, made a loud squeak, and then flew to the ground, picked up the wand, and flew away with it. Tiana and Matthew gathered in the village in the early morning of May 1st to help Aunt Lexi with chores for the holiday, cleaning up the grounds, planting vegetables. In the evening the plan was kebabs, baked potatoes, and a picnic. The young people had already left the house and were packing their bags with things in the car. Suddenly Matthew was called by a familiar voice. He turned around. "Mom, how are you here?" He was surprised. "I mean, how did you find me?" Tiana froze in front of the car. She was overcome by the echoes of that nasty feeling, when in winter she stood on the doorstep of a stranger's apartment and listened to nasty things about herself. "Old friends helped," Nelly answered. "I wanted to talk about everything that had happened." Her mother's voice was unaccustomedly soft, not dictatorial. There was a hint that she was holding them back. Or maybe it was something else. "Mom, if you're talking about the same thing again, my decision hasn't changed." Matthew grabbed his bag of things. "No, son, Suddenly tears came out of Nelly's voice and she began to wipe them away with her fingers. Tiana and Matthew were hurrying Tiana to get her out of her stupor, and Matthew because he had never seen his mother cry in his life. There were times he wondered if she was even capable of it. The boy hastily put his arm around the woman and began to soothe her. "Don't cry, Mom, everything is fine. What's wrong?" "Oh, Matthew, son, I have so much to tell you." Nelly turned to Tiana, "and to apologize to you. Come with us to the village." Matthew looked at his mother. "We'll rest, we'll sit, we'll get to know everyone. It's a holiday, it's spring. He nodded to Tiana, and she tilted her head in agreement, showing that she supported the idea. Aunt Lexi took the unexpected guest's visit well. Tiana had never told her about what had happened between her and her chosen one's mother, so the acquaintance was easy and relaxed. Nayeli and Aunt Lexi found common ground surprisingly quickly and began discussing recipes while sitting at a table in front of the porch. Matthew had pulled the table from the kitchen in anticipation of the evening's gatherings. The women tried to help the young men clean up the grounds, but they only waved their hands. "Why are you staring at your mom like you're seeing her for the first time?" Tiana nudged Matthew lightly with her elbow as they cleaned up last year's dry leaves and branches from the vegetable garden. "I saw her for the first time." The young man leaned his gloved hands on the handle of the rake. "Not a real one. How is this woman different from the one who all my childhood fed me porridge, according to the regimen, scolded me for being 2 minutes late?" By evening, when all the pressing matters were over, the kebabs were fried and the table was set, the small group finally sat down together. Nayeli, who had traveled light from the city, covered herself with a fur shawl. Aunt Lexi got the house wine, set out the best appetizers. She'd even laid a festive white tablecloth, which everyone had persistently discouraged her from doing. When, if not tonight, the stubborn hostess diligently straightened the corners and smoothed the pattern in the center. Tiana turned on the antique radio, which, like a grasshopper, stuck its long antenna whiskers out the window, and the chatter of the presenters and retro songs came on. The evening became especially soulful when it got dark and some smooth melody played on the airwaves. Nayeli suddenly rose from the table, glass in hand. "I want to apologize," she began, taking a deep breath. "First and foremost to you, Tiana. I behaved abominably. I apologize for my rudeness, my arrogance. I can see that my son is happy with you, and for any mother, that is what matters most." Tiana smiled with one eye at Nayeli's mute question. As she continued, "I want to apologize to you, Matthew. I've tried to be the best mother for you, to replace your father and grandparents. But in this list of duties and discipline, I forgot about the simple moments of warmth, childhood joys, and your dreams. Forgive me, my boy." She discreetly took the napkin from her son's hands and blotted her wet eyes again. "Mother, you'd better stop it." "There's no need to apologize." Matthew took the woman's hand. No, I know what I'm saying," Nayeli interrupted him. She looked at Aunt Lexi. "And I want to apologize to you too." "Why should I apologize?" The hostess splayed her hands, nearly knocking over the decanter. "To you and all the people who live in the villages. I always thought of them as second class, uneducated and stupid. I see now that I was terribly mistaken. It was only in my old age that I realized the blinders I'd been wearing all my life." Nayeli exhaled and drank all that was in the glass in a gulp. "Oh, what a useless girl you are. We need a vegetable garden, and we have rattles in our hands." Aunt Lexi scolded her. "But since tonight is such an evening, I have something to say, too." Matthew looked around at the crowd. "The first news is that I've been hired as a paralegal. After the semester ends, I'm going to start practicing my profession. The second," he turned to Tiana, who was all animated with anticipation. For her, the news of the paralegal was indeed a surprise. But the real surprises were ahead. "Tiana." Matthew turned to her with his whole body. "I'd like to believe that a girl like you wouldn't give up the humble burden of being a lawyer's wife." That's how it happened that night. "Will you marry me?" Matthew asked. Aunt Lexi opened her mouth in surprise. Nayeli let a second wave of tears fall, barely recovering from her loud apology. Tiana stared in amazement at the thin dainty ring in a simple box. "I'll do it with the cab driver's husband," she exclaimed, jumped up and hugged Matthew tightly, not believing what was happening. After the hugs, congratulations, and toasts, they began a loud discussion about the upcoming wedding. Aunt Lexi said the celebration should be a village tradition. Nayeli argued with her, insisting on a restaurant. Matthew intervened when the relatives got to the point of discussing the festive table. "No one is getting married yet. It's too early to plan hot salads," he calmly reassured them. "Women should plan ahead," Nayeli replied. That's right, Aunt Lexi said. "What if I don't have enough pickles?" Tiana laughed out loud. Everyone else laughed too. It was past midnight when they decided to call it a night. Matthew took his mother into the house. Nayli was tired from the events, the long journey, and the revelations, so she fell asleep, barely touching her pillow. Tiana and Aunt Lexi were clearing the table. The woman suddenly froze as she carried the plates into the house. "What is it, Auntie?" Tiana asked, noticing it. "I told you that Pebble was good luck," sneaky Aunt Lexi said with a sly squint. "Now it's going to decorate the second wedding." Tiana looked at her reflection in the glass of the veranda, where her face was reflected in the bright lantern like a mirror. Her hair and earrings with Ural emeralds glistened.